Chapter 8:20. Sulu had no interest in cows, even if they were cows. For him, whose hunger had reached an unbearable level, the only thing that could arouse his interest now was everything that could be eaten, including the bewildered and ignorant bison in front of him. As for the bull that was about to attack him, it had already become countless plates of delicious Linuan steaks in his eyes. In the twilight, the grasslands seemed to be burning. He stood on a stone and looked at the bison that were surrounded by hostility. He said, "Let me tell you something." He said, "The people of the Imperium said that the Federation attacked them because they wanted the crystal mine. The people of the Federation said that they were brutally slaughtered by the people of the Imperium when they went to the scientific research, so they attacked them back. Some people say that this is competition, a living space. I don't know if this is right, but I think that if you are strong, you should get more food and more beautiful women. Look just like you." He looked at the leader of the bison that was getting angrier and angrier. He spread his hands and said, "Then why do you guys have so much land? Why does the Federation have to build such a long wall? I am stronger than you, so you should just let me eat you." At this time, the grassland in the twilight seemed to have turned into a wide square. The rock under his feet was the rostrum, and the bison were the bewildered audience. He had just made an extremely retarded speech. Whether it was the content, the choice of audience, or the environment, they were all extremely retarded. From another point of view, it could be said that he was pretending. Sulu was a person with such a temperament. It was just that the mental shock he had received these days was too strong, and he had been holding it in his chest and abdomen. Until now, he had vented some of it by giving a speech to the bison. Otherwise, he might have been suffocated to death before he was caught by the Federation government. Giving a speech to a bison was essentially no different from playing the lute to a bison. Since the angry leader of the bison couldn't understand his words, it naturally wouldn't walk to the front with tears on its face and kneel on the ground to offer its own flesh and blood. Instead, it let out a crazy howl and rushed over with its head down. Its sharp and hard horns seemed to be stained with blood in the twilight. Then, it turned into fresh, hand-torn beef. His fingers sank deep into the soft and slightly warm beef. He tore the beef into strips and sent them into his mouth, chewing them until they were like mud. Then he slowly swallowed them into his stomach, nourishing his stomach that was about to wither from hunger. He leaned against the tree trunk and ate silently with his head lowered. From time to time, he would grab the grass beside him and wipe off the blood on his hands. He did not pay attention to the cow that was looking at him in horror not far away. In the interior of the wildlife sanctuary, there were not as many surveillance cameras and GPS chips as there were in the city. In addition, the Federation government definitely would not expect him to appear in this grassland, so there should not be any highly sensitive military satellites in the night sky above his head. However, Sulu still did not dare to light a fire. A fire in the dark would undoubtedly attract the attention of the Federal Central Computer, so he could only eat the raw beef in silence. If he chewed the fresh beef for a long time, there would be a faint sweetness, but he still felt a little disgusted. The main reason was that when the strips of meat were chewed by his teeth, there would always be some blood at the corner of his mouth. Fortunately, there was a small stream not far away. Otherwise, he would not even be willing to give up the blood. Too primitive, too barbaric, too bloody. While eating the raw beef, he muttered in a low voice. He did not stop eating until his empty stomach was almost 80% full. As if he had completed the most difficult task, he walked to the stream to drink water. He simply washed his face, tiredly lying on the grass, and casually pulled a few handfuls of wild grass to cover his body. After escaping from the strict military prison and the fate of death, he came to the quiet grassland. The combination of physical exhaustion and mental relaxation made him unable to sleep. He was not worried about the eyes that were staring at him in the dark, whether they were lions, jackals, or tigresses. The heavy bison corpse at the edge of the forest was a deterrent to all the most ferocious beasts. Compared to the beasts inside the wall that knew fear, he was even more unwilling to face the stubborn humans outside the wall. So at this moment, the relaxation was so real. The sky was dotted with stars, and the two moons did not appear. The grassland in the dark was bathed in the light of the stars, turning into a beautiful but absolutely unreal picture. A slightly cold wind blew from an unknown direction, causing wrinkles to appear on the surface of the calm stream and rustling the wild grass on his face. Such a night and such a state of mind was actually very suitable for jumping into the stream and jumping around like a child, letting the white splashes splash everywhere in the quiet night like sprinkling joy. But Su Lu just lay there calmly, narrowing his eyes and looking at the stars in the night sky above his head, counting them over and over again. There should only be wild animals inside the wall. The sudden appearance of a naked man shouting would definitely attract the attention of the charter computer, and it would certainly not think that there were really savages on planet S1. There was another more important reason why he did not jump into the stream to take a bath. After soaking in the sea for so long, he now had the uncomfortable feeling of vomiting just thinking about water. Su Lu started counting the stars in the night sky for the 4th time, but he still could not sleep. The exhaustion in his body was completely opposite to the relaxation and joy in his mind. He could not help but think of the people outside the wall again, especially those he cared about. At this moment, he wanted to know the whereabouts of Huai Chaoshi the most. The government's pursuit of her was definitely far more intense than his own. An imperial princess appearing on planet S1 would definitely cause the most frenzied response from the Federation, and she would definitely not be allowed to leave the capital ring alive. Other than that spinning cup of tea, Su Lu had not seen the powerful strength of Li Pifu, the god of war. He also had not fought with Feng Yu. Huai Chaoshi was the most powerful combat machine he had ever encountered in his life, and there was no comparison, regardless of gender. But Su Lu still did not think that she could hold out for too long under the frenzied pursuit of the Federation. The reason was simple. This was Planet S1 of the Federation, a battlefield she was most unfamiliar with, and this battlefield was shrouded in the omnipotent glory of the Charter. How could he find her? The pair of small eyes in the gaps of the weeds narrowed, as bright as the stars in the sky. Su Lu silently and quickly analyzed. First of all, he rejected the possibility of Huai Chaoshi entering the Federation through Bermuda's disguise after forcibly crossing the space passage. This was because the Federation was extremely strict on the identity of returnees from Bermuda, especially after the Imperial Seed Plan was exposed. The scope and strictness of the chip's examination had even begun to make people's hair stand on end in fear. Since the 37th constitutional era, only 2 groups of imperial people had successfully arrived at the Federation's capital ring. The first group was the official diplomatic mission, and the second group was the negotiation team of the Underground Resistance Organization. Su Lu narrowed his eyes and gradually approached the truth of the situation. He did not think about how Huai Chaoshi had infiltrated the diplomatic mission of the Underground Resistance Organization. He only needed to think about how she had left the diplomatic mission and arrived at the snowy ground outside the military prison of Qingqing. The ubiquitous scanning equipment in the fields of the Federation cities would automatically scan the human body under surveillance, and the person being scanned would often be unaware. It was just like the Blue Passage in the major spaceports, except that it was much smaller and invisible. Any human without a chip behind their neck would immediately trigger the charter computer's high alert. According to Su Li's understanding, the only way to block the Federation's electronic surveillance network was to use the small blue light device designed by Feng Yu. He had assembled it several times before, so he knew very well that the small blue light device's structure did not seem complicated, but the design concept and the related adaptive frequency band coverage curve were a complete mess of genius. In particular, it required the initial activation of the program fragment in the bracelet on his left wrist. Other than Feng Yu and himself, no one else should be able to make it. Zhou Yu had once told him that before Shi Qinghai died, he had given him a small device that emitted blue light at the Charter Square. She acutely guessed that Shi Qinghai might have used this device to successfully infiltrate Parliament Hill and those heavily guarded places. At that time, Su Li's mood was a little strange, so he did not answer. Going back in time, perhaps many years ago, Feng Yu had known Chao Chiudao. He did not know whether his identity at that time was George Carlin or Professor Jean. He only knew that Feng Yu had generously given Chao Chiudao a small blue light device, which indirectly made him the greatest spy in the 37 years of history. After Chao Chiudao found out that he had cancer, he passed the device to Shi Qinghai, and before Shi Qinghai died, he passed it to Zhou Yu. If Feng Yu did not leave more generous gifts in the Federation, Huai Chaoshi must have met with Zhou Yu. Su Lu made a simple and clear inference, and then made a simple and clear decision. He stood up from the stream, and under the cover of the night, stepped on the wild grass, and walked towards the northwest without hesitation. No matter how he analyzed it, that Highness had no reason to take the risk to enter the Federation. This had nothing to do with the judgment of interests. It was even possible that the interests of the Empire would suffer an unprecedented loss because of her death. But she simply came, crossing the distance of countless light years, and arrived in the snow, and said in the forest, "Little brother, come home with me." Therefore, Su Le did not have any other choice. He could only climb over the wall that represented safety, return to the dangerous world, and simply go, find her. Su Le had never been a believer of bloodlines. He was incomparably contemptuous of the so-called aristocratic temperament, the demeanor of an aristocratic family, and the titles such as Crown Prince. But many years later, when he thought of this period of time, he would at least admit that he and that Highness were very similar in some aspects. Their appearances were ordinary, simple, and direct. Outside a certain quiet courtyard in the capital, there was suddenly the sound of hurried tires grinding. Before the soldiers in charge of security had any time to react, they watched as more than a dozen bulletproof military vehicles fiercely crashed through the railings and rushed downstairs. With a grave expression, Colonel Li Feng jumped out of the military vehicle and made a standard tactical command with his right hand. Behind him, dozens of the most elite Federation Special Forces members quickly surrounded the base of the Empire's underground resistance mission. Madman Li looked at the tightly shut door, and the tips of his eyebrows slowly furrowed. Today, he had forcibly conscripted the Special Forces directly under Small Eye's department. Under the command of the high-sequence incident of the charter computer, all the powerful agencies of the government had thrown themselves into this battle. The area within dozens of square kilometers had already become an absolute forbidden zone. But he was still very cautious, because the woman he had to deal with today was so powerful, more powerful than he had imagined, and she had already very simply given proof. Chapter 8:21. Where are my two subordinates? I should be the one asking you this question, not you. I really didn't expect that such a rude scene would appear in the Democratic and Free Federation. Which unit do you belong to? If you insist on searching for the diplomatic mission, then I must warn you that the negotiations may break down at any time. The Federation must take full responsibility. Mr. Mu En waved his arms angrily and expressed the most violent protest to the Federation soldiers who rushed in. However, Madman Li's face was cold and indifferent. He didn't even look at him and directly kicked open the door in front of him. The room was empty. The senior Federation official in charge of receiving the diplomatic mission hurriedly walked to the door and whispered while wiping his sweat, "Colonel, please pay attention to the diplomatic impact." Madman Li stared at the empty room with an expressionless face. He wasn't surprised and didn't give any explanation. He walked out of the building with the group of elite soldiers. After making a phone call, he sat in the bulletproof military vehicle. Before closing the door, he subconsciously glanced at a certain corner of the courtyard wall. On his cold face that had been maintaining high vigilance and releasing biting cold killing intent without hiding anything, a smile suddenly appeared. "Your Highness, I really want to know how long you can hide." Su Lu also wanted to know the answer to this question. According to the guidance of the precise map, he used a few days to cross the largest grassland in the Yellow Pine Wildlife Sanctuary and arrived outside of another long electronic wall in the northwest direction. Looking at the faintly visible skyline of the capital's special district in the distance, he narrowed his eyes. He knew that once he climbed over the wall, what would be waiting for him would be a never-ending search and pursuit. The city of the Federation, for him who didn't have a chip on the back of his neck, was more like a dangerous primitive forest. Those cold metal probes and the Federation citizens in the buildings and alleys could become the most terrifying venomous snakes and startled birds at any time, bringing him the most powerful enemies. He climbed over the wall and used the shortest amount of time to get a set of clean clothes and a hat with an extremely wide brim in a certain house in the suburbs. Then he quickly left and entered the underground passage through a standard civilian wastewater treatment base station. Sula didn't know if the system had scanned his body during this process, or if the omnipresent glory of the charter had discovered him. He was just gambling. His short, straight black hair was faintly wet. It wasn't until he entered the deep underground tunnel that his nervousness was slightly relieved. The city's underground system, which was as dense as a spider's web and extended in all directions, gave him the greatest sense of security, regardless of whether he was on the Empire's Tianjing planet, the port city, or the capital. However, on the first day he climbed over the electronic wall and returned to human society. After walking less than 400 meters in the dark underground waterway, this sense of security suddenly left his body. In its place was a strange feeling of being watched and a strong intuition of danger. Sula suddenly stopped and raised his head to look at the dim self-sensor lamp above him. His thick black eyebrows furrowed tightly. He knew that he had made a special and absolute mistake. Other than the Bureau of Proclamation, no one knew how many chip scanners were in use in all corners of the Federation. However, one could imagine that it was definitely a terrifying number. Otherwise, it wouldn't be able to maintain the foundation of the glory of the Charter. These scanners might be unnoticeable redundant parts in some large equipment, or they might be very simple components in daily necessities. They were like countless lifeless eyes, coldly and silently watching everything in human society. Perhaps, there was also such an eye in that dim self-sensor lamp. Similarly, other than the Bureau of Proclamation, no other government department had the authority to use these eyes. This was the Federation's first-level surveillance network. It was completely different from the second-level surveillance network that the Federation Investigation Bureau could control alone. It was on a completely different level. During the previous months of battle, whenever the Federation government wanted to force Sulu into a desperate situation, he would always dive into the underground waterway system. This was because this was the blind spot of the second-level surveillance network. At that time, the Federal Central Computer still had a person named Philip. He struggled but stood firmly behind Sulu, making it impossible for the Federation to use the first-level surveillance network to find him. However, the situation now was completely different. Philip was dead. He no longer had the authority of the first-level sequence. On the contrary, he had become an anomaly that had to be caught by the first-level sequence. The Federal Central Computer would definitely activate the first-level surveillance network. Who knew how many dangers were hidden in this deep underground tunnel? Moreover, he was the only one walking in it. It was very easy for him to become the most obvious lighthouse. It was very easy to discover him. Since he knew that he had made a mistake, he immediately remedied it. Sula didn't try to destroy all the electronic devices in the underground tunnel. This was because that would be a stupid thing to do. Apart from exhausting him to death, more importantly, destroying Charter's eyes under these circumstances would only allow the Federation to discover him earlier. Therefore, he began to run at high speed in the dark underground tunnel. The sound of his footsteps echoed endlessly. He crawled out of the nearest tunnel entrance. The surface was bustling with activity. It was the time when the sun was at its most beautiful. The chill of early winter was slowly dispelled. Couples watching early movies and old people who had just finished their morning exercises were walking on the streets with smiles on their faces. Sulu pulled the brim of his hat lower as he quickly walked through the crowd. His body felt a little stiff because of nervousness. He knew that if he was recognized, the peaceful smile on people's faces would turn into a moment of shock. After that, it would definitely change into a face that he didn't want to see. Walking through the bustling streets and through the alleys that were filled with the smell of vegetable porridge and fried synthetic meat, Sulu silently looked at the electronic valve in the underground tunnel. He knew that he had definitely been discovered by the glory of the Charter. However, he didn't know how long it would take for the other party to calculate and report the procedures, and how long it would take for the other party to send a combat force to hunt him down. From escaping from Donglin to the capital ring until nearly a year before the Black Dream, Sula had been living a nervous life. He was afraid that the glory of the charter would discover his secret. He repeatedly read the 700,000-word charter provisions and collected all the relevant procedures on the network. He also made very detailed preparations for this extremely terrifying possibility. In a sense, other than Feng Yu, Su Lu was the human who understood the operation of the glory of the charter the best. He even understood it better than the employees of the Bureau of Proclamation. Because of the old thing, he didn't have the opportunity to use this knowledge and countermeasures in the past few years. Until this moment. Standing silently in front of the metal valve, Su Lu used less than 10 seconds to calculate the time difference between him being discovered and the arrival of the federal forces. Then he looked at the condom vending machine beside him and said softly with a smile, "I don't know if you're in here, but I know that you must have seen me again. I know you very well. You can't directly do physical operations now. You have to sound the alarm, and you have to wait for human approval. So you're very slow, too slow. So how can you catch up to me?" As if he wanted to vent the anger of the old thing, Su Lu laughed at the glory of the charter that he thought was lifeless. Then he made a very surprising decision. He opened the electronic valve, returned to the deep underground space, and began to run again. He ran for several kilometers underground, then returned to the surface, passed through the crowd, and then sneaked into the ground again. He did not tire of repeating the boring process. His brain was working quickly, designing the most reasonable route. In this way, he attracted and even teased the countless eyes of the glory of the charter. He knew that danger or death was approaching him step by step, but there was no panic on his face. Because after countless transitions between the underground and the surface, he had arrived at the place he wanted to go, the Shell Motor Corporation Research Institute's third department. Maybe it was because the Double Moon Festival was approaching, or for some other reason, the Husk Institute was very quiet on the weekend. The graduate students who worked overtime in the past were nowhere to be found. Su Lu pulled down the brim of his hat, squinted his eyes in the shadows, and walked into the building like a very ordinary staff member. The third department of the Research Institute was the same as before. There were 2 armed soldiers standing in front of the door. This place was responsible for some of the very important research missions of the federal military, so the security measures were very tight. About 30 meters away, Su Lu slowly folded the card in his hand as he walked. He didn't know where he got the fiber paper card from, but it was soft and tough. Between his steady fingers, he repeatedly folded the card many times. The folded part suddenly became hard and sharp. This was the only weapon he had on him. When he was about 5 meters away from the 2 military police, a sharp alarm suddenly sounded in the Husk Institute, and the clear sound of sirens came from the street behind him. What was even more frightening was that in the direction of the second teaching building of the military academy, there were 3 Vortex jet-armed helicopters approaching at high speed. The semi-fixed Darlin machine guns next to the helicopters were black and dazzling. Finally, they caught up with him half a minute earlier than expected. It seemed that in order to hunt him down, the government, which had always been full of bureaucracy, finally showed unprecedented efficiency. Su Lu sighed in his heart with some regret, and then clenched the paper card in his hand. The 2 soldiers at the entrance of the Research Institute heard the sharp alarm behind them, and then they immediately reacted. They raised the guns in their hands and pointed at Su Lu, who was walking towards them, and said sternly, "Please identify yourself." Just as they raised their guns, Su Li's calf muscles suddenly tightened. His body rushed forward with a whoosh, and the hard paper card in his hand was swung out twice. 2 extremely thin bloodstains suddenly appeared on the wrists of the 2 soldiers, and the guns in their hands fell to the ground. However, just as the guns left their hands, Su Li's hard arms had already smashed into their necks, causing them to faint faster than the guns. Ear-piercing sounds of brakes, hurried footsteps, and the sound of guns being loaded came from the back of the Research Institute, but Su Lu didn't seem to notice. He reached out and grabbed the submachine gun in the air, passed through the closed door of the Research Institute at high speed, and rushed in like a gust of wind. The sharp alarm inside the building was very ear-piercing, and the emergency lights kept flashing. The few researchers who were still working overtime stayed in their workrooms according to the relevant regulations, and at the same time, completely locked the indestructible alloy door of the room. A reinforced transparent material wall blocked in front of Su Lu, and the door at the back of the passage was violently breaking open. If he couldn't deal with this wall that suddenly appeared in front of him, then he would immediately be crushed to death by the endless Federation soldiers. "So you're still here?" Su Lu looked at the peace axe that had been silent for too long on the wall, and said silently in his heart. Then he took it down and violently chopped down on the reinforced transparent wall. 3 muffled sounds of the axe striking rang out, and countless fine cracks appeared on the solid transparent wall. An instant later, it collapsed with a rustle, splattering everywhere on the ground. Holding the peace axe and continuing forward silently, Su Lu seemed to have returned to that night many years ago. Back then, in order to stop Lin Yuanhu from stealing Professor Shin's data, he used this axe in his hand to forcefully chop forward, and in the end, the chop gave him the life of an outstanding general. Any problem that was difficult to solve could only be solved with violence in the end. This wasn't Su Li's life creed, but his instinctive reaction. After Professor Shin passed away, the 2-story workshop that originally belonged to him should have long belonged to someone else, but Su Lu unexpectedly found that the electronic door's password was still the same complicated string of numbers from back then, without any changes. Throwing the heavy peace axe that was no longer of any use to the ground, Su Lu walked into the workshop that he hadn't returned to in many years. Looking at the holographic screen table and large workbench that didn't seem to have changed much, he vaguely understood that this should be the additional result brought about by the successful development of the MX Mecha. The success of the MX Mecha was the most important gain of the Shell Motor Company in recent years, and the most important factor wasn't the engineering department, but Professor Shin Yulin's theories and the last assistant or student in his life, Su Lu. When Dean Lin Yuanhu's reputation was ruined, Professor Shin was pushed back to the altar by many of the scarecrows on the wall, and after Su Lu became a hero of the Federation, this workshop that had been forgotten for many years naturally became a legendary place in the Shell Motor Company. In fact, in the hearts of the younger generation of scholars, this was already a holy land, and naturally required special protection. Regarding these matters, Su Lu had heard some of them from the CEO of Shell Motor Company, but he hadn't paid much attention in the past. Today, however, he discovered that the company's preservation of this office provided a lot of convenience for his plans. With a sudden force of his arm, the hard alloy floor was lifted up, revealing an extremely simple-looking small instrument. There was no dust on it, but there were no signs that it had been activated. Su Lu took the small instrument and walked up to the second floor, smiling slightly. It was as if he had brushed shoulders with the old professor smoking at the top of the stairs, as if he could still see the clear yellow spots on the old man's face. He entered the ventilation duct in the ceiling and forcefully broke through the brick wall at the back of the research institute. He dropped down from a high place, and just as his feet touched the ground, a tyrannical force suddenly erupted, turning the downward momentum into horizontal movement. With a boom, he knocked away several Federation soldiers who were setting up an ambush circle, and like a violent shadow, he rushed into the distance. A moment later, Su Lu appeared on the campus of the First Military Academy. The forest in the early winter still retained a rare hint of green. He crossed his arms and slowly walked around the lake tower, as relaxed as a tourist. With his hands in his pockets, the small instrument emitted a strange blue light. Chapter 8:22. The density of the glory of the charter followed a certain pattern. The hidden lines around the densely populated areas and the passages connecting two densely populated areas were the top priority of the central computer's surveillance. Countless pairs of eyes were hidden in every corner and in every electrical appliance. As for the inside of the settlements, places like the Bureau of Proclamation, the President's residence, and the Parliament Hill were naturally under strict surveillance. In comparison, places like the campus were much less monitored. Carrying the blue light that could temporarily block the Federation's surveillance, Su Lu strolled around the beautiful and quiet campus in the winter, passing by young couples in military uniforms. His heart was not as relaxed as his expression. Facing the entire Federation and the omnipresent cold light, it was very difficult to find a perfect solution, including the blue light in his pocket. Not to mention that even if he could temporarily disappear from the sight of the Federation, there was no way he could cover the eyes of all the people. No matter what era, once the power of the people was stimulated, it would be the most unstoppable flood. This power could change dynasties and expand the territory. Naturally, it could also easily destroy the former hero of the Federation and the current seed of the Empire. After leaving the campus of the First Military Academy, Su-Le lowered the brim of his hat and followed the crowd that was as quiet as usual but brought him endless pressure. He took the number 14 fully enclosed track and came to a quiet area like a farm in the suburbs of the capital. This was the second important node in his escape plan, Whitewater Security Company's building. The reason why he came to this building belonging to the Nutshell Group was naturally not because he suddenly felt nostalgic during his escape, although it was in this building that he met Magnolia and officially took over Group 7. The main reason he took the risk to sneak in today was the armory under the building. In addition to all kinds of guns, there were also all kinds of multi-axis CNC precision machine tools that he liked the most since he was young. 4 hours later, when Su-Le walked out of the Whitewater Security Company building with his cap lowered, he had already changed into a new set of clothes. The black fabric and cut looked extremely ordinary, and it was difficult to attract any attention in a crowd. In fact, it was carefully designed by the Nutshell-related research department. The fabric was wear-resistant, had a certain degree of sharp-edge defense, and was extremely difficult to burn. The cut and the inner lining were hidden, and the design made it convenient for movement and firearms. It perfectly met the needs of urban warfare. His preparation for the battle was not limited to this. On the surface of his bulletproof vest, there was a row of soft metal strips, which once again strengthened the anti-cut effect. According to his calculations, as long as he was not surrounded by an entire combat unit, then it would be very difficult for scattered gunshots to hurt him. The main problem that needed to be solved was close combat damage. Their next target was Lin Yuan. Wearing a black suit, he silently walked to the side of the road and hailed a returning taxi. When he got in, he accidentally bumped into the heavy metal door, making a strange sound. The taxi driver looked back at him in puzzlement. Su-Le lowered his head. Naturally, it was not convenient for him to explain to the driver that under his black suit, there were 2 modified guns that were disassembled into parts. A sharp dagger was tied to his left calf, and a delicate military knife was tied to his right calf. Moreover, it could spurt out terrifying electric arcs at any time. "There are so many of you, how can you not guard him?" In the Nanxiang family's manor in the suburbs of the capital, the Nanxiang's wife angrily scolded the head of security in front of her. She did not even let go of the Westwood's Zhong family's special forces officer. Her right hand trembled slightly in anger, and she said in a cold voice, "And you, since you insist on being responsible for personal defense, now that he is missing, how do you want to be responsible?" The loyal Westwood's officer had already fallen into an ice cellar at this time. Facing the stern reprimand of the Nanxiang's wife, he wanted to shoot himself to death. He was ashamed and regretful to the extreme, so how could he have the face to defend himself? The door of the villa was pushed open, and Nan Xiangmei ran in. The tiny beads of sweat on her beautiful face revealed her worry. In the afternoon, she was discussing with the sponsor about the orphan education project at the foundation when she suddenly received a call from home. She hurried back, but she did not know what happened and saw this scene. The Nanxiang's wife and her mother were very few women in a big family who really had some kind of valuable moral character. They were kind and gentle by nature. No matter what class they faced, they would naturally maintain due respect. Such a stern reprimand like this rarely happened to them. Nan Xiangmei looked at her mother in surprise, and some very bad thoughts appeared in her heart. She hurriedly asked, "Mom, what happened?" The Nanxiang's wife looked back at her daughter, and after a moment of silence, she whispered, "Our little princess is missing. It's physics class in the morning. You also know that the child's talent in physics is amazing, so I specially invited an associate professor from the First Academy to teach her." However, when the class was over, the door was still closed. At that time, everyone just thought that she was intoxicated in the world of those lines, and did not think of anything else. The Nanxiang's wife frowned slightly and said, Until lunch, there was still no movement upstairs. The maid urged several times, but there was no reply. When I went upstairs to take a look, I found that the door was locked. When I opened it, what you see now was what you see now. Nan Xiangmei stared at the study in a daze. She looked at the physics associate professor who was tied up like a desk lamp in the corner of the room. She looked at the frightened expression on the associate professor's face and couldn't react for a while. She knew that Zhong Huiyan had a talent in physics that was absolutely impossible for children of the same age to have. When they were chatting at night, the little girl was very proud of this and firmly linked it to Su Lu. She believed that this proved that she and Su Lu had some kind of natural intimacy, so the Nanxiang's family thought of specially inviting an associate professor to be a private teacher for her. But now, what was this? Obviously, the little girl used some kind of method to knock out the associate professor, and then quietly climbed downstairs through the window, across the manor's lawn, and ran away like that. The Nanxiang's wife seemed to be narrating a very interesting thing, but the worry and tension between her eyebrows couldn't be concealed. The little girl who left home was no ordinary person. She was the little princess of Silin's Zhong family, the successor of the Zhong family that was personally judged by the Supreme Court's Chief Judge He Ying. How much trust did Big Stick Tian have in the southern minister's wife when he rushed to the empire's front lines and sent this little princess to the southern minister's manor? If the little princess left the Nanxiang's family just like that, how could the Nanxiang's wife face this trust? Impossible! Nan Xiangmei clenched her fists tightly, frowned and said, "She's just a 12-year-old girl. How could she avoid the manor's surveillance? The lawn outside is so wide. I think she should still be hiding in the building and hasn't left the manor." The Nanxiang's wife patted her daughter's trembling back and said softly, "We've already searched 3 times. If she's still in the manor, we'll definitely find her. Immediately call the police and ask the government for help. If there's no other way, let father go and persuade the Bureau of Proclamation to locate the chip." Nan Xiangmei turned her head and said with a firm expression, "Mother, we must find her. No matter how good the security of the Federation is, it's not safe for a little girl like her." The Nanxiang's wife was silent for a long time, then firmly shook her head and refused her daughter's proposal. "No, you should be able to guess who she's looking for. This is not the key to the problem. The key is her identity. If the government knows that she's missing, how will they react? In such a tense situation, her safety may be in greater danger. The disappearance of the successor of the Zhong family will cause too much chaos. First of all, her heartless cousin will definitely not miss this opportunity. Then the Westwoods will inevitably fall into another round of turmoil, and the other side will not be able to bear it." The Nanxiang's wife explained in a heavy tone. "Then what can we do? It's winter now, she's still so young. She didn't show any intention of leaving before, or I didn't notice it at all." Nan Xiangmei said sadly, "Mother, I feel so useless. I've already asked the family to send people to look for her, don't worry too much." The Nanxiang's wife hugged her daughter and comforted her. "The Special Forces soldiers in the Westwoods who are responsible for protecting her can't go to look for her. Otherwise, some people will be suspicious. I've ordered them to stay in the manor and not take a single step out." "Then, what about the associate professor? He knows about this whole thing." Nan Xiangmei looked at the associate professor who was tied up in the corner. She was shocked and forgot to untie the rope for him. She was about to walk forward, but was gently pulled by her mother. She didn't know whether it was because she was ashamed of herself, or because she was angry at the whole thing today. The Nanxiang's wife looked at the associate professor on the ground and humiliated him. Such a big man was knocked unconscious by a little girl. "If I were you, I'd just buy a vernier caliper and kill myself." In order to prevent the news from leaking out, before little fireworks is found, you'll stay in my manor as a private teacher. You're not allowed to leave or contact the outside world. Of course, someone will help you apply for leave from the First People's Hospital, and your salary will be tripled. The associate professor in the corner saw that the lady didn't seem to have the intention to kill him, so the panic on his face subsided a lot. But after hearing this sentence, he began to struggle emotionally again. Nan Xiangmei looked at him apologetically, then turned her head to look out of the window worriedly. Looking at the slowly falling snowflakes outside the window, a heart-wrenching scene unexpectedly appeared in front of her eyes. A little girl in thin clothes was hugging her knees, squatting in a dark corner of the city, shivering because of the cold. I said, "I want rum coffee, but don't mix it with alcohol. I'm not of legal drinking age this year. Are you deliberately trying to induce me to commit a crime? Although I know very well that the shareholders of your cafe are all descendants of the old generals in the courtyard across the street, but if you insist on mixing alcohol in this cup of coffee, I will definitely not mind reporting it to the Children's Rights and Interests Protection Fund." The waiter looked at the delicate little girl in the seat with an embarrassed expression, thinking that he had seen a lot of difficult customers, but it was rare to see someone like her. She could be called a strange flower in the difficult world. "Little friend, rum coffee must be mixed with rum. I have just recommended several types of low-caffeine coffee suitable for you, but you insist on this one." So, the cafe was warm and cozy. The delicate little girl kept looking out of the window, staring at the West Mountain courtyard across the street. A thick pink woolen coat was folded on the side, and on top of it was a pair of white rabbit-shaped earmuffs, looking very cute. "Don't call me little friend, you can call me customer. Forget it, just give me a cup of green tea and some low-sugar snacks." The little girl turned her head and said helplessly. She waved her hand to let the waiter leave, then put down the obviously old doll in her arms, opened the electronic map in her mobile phone, and began to seriously calculate the probability and design a new road map. Chapter 8:23. The green tea was served, and so were the crispy wheat biscuits. Zhong Huiyan rolled her black eyes, picked up a piece of biscuit, and put it into the teacup. She curiously watched it gradually soften before she put it into her mouth and slowly sipped it. She let out a sigh of satisfaction, and her smiling eyes were like the two moons that had not yet come out. "Sister Nan Xiang, I'm really sorry, but it's time for me to leave. Although your manner is very good, it's not my own home after all." Thinking that there must be many people in the manor who were worried and sad about her departure, Zhong Huiyan couldn't help but sigh again, but this sigh was full of apology. Immediately she shrugged and said to herself, "But the monitoring system of your manor is too stupid. It's not difficult at all. It's definitely not as good as the process of that guy escaping from the military prison." Full and warm, she turned her head to look out of the window, carefully watching the West Mountain compound across the street, silently wondering when that guy would come here. She firmly believed that she was the one who knew Su Le best in this universe. That stone-like guy had never been really cold. He, who valued feelings, would definitely tell her something before leaving the Federation and reminisce about the past. And the woman and her child in this West Mountain compound were undoubtedly the people that he had to stay away from. Suddenly, Zhong Huiyan's brows wrinkled into a cute crease, and she found that she had made a big mistake. Because of that guy's stubborn character, he would definitely not let the people he cared about most be involved in danger, so it was very likely that he would not come here during his escape. "Brother Su Le, where will you go?" Zhong Yan's brows loosened and she was annoyed. She pouted her watery lips in a fit of pique and began to put on the pink thick woolen coat. She put on the fluffy rabbit earmuffs, carried the heavy backpack, and picked up the old doll. She walked out of the cafe and came to the Winter Street. The backpack was the luggage she had prepared for herself. Because she didn't know how long this trip would take and how far it would take, it was stuffed with a lot of messy things that she thought were very necessary. Compared to the little girl's body, the heavy bag seemed particularly large. It was almost dragged to the ground, forming a particularly exaggerated visual contrast. The cold wind of early winter blew the fallen leaves into her collar, instantly making her face a little red. She blew on her hands, looked forward, and said with determination, "Little watermelon, you have grown up, so you must learn how to protect yourself. You have to wear warmer clothes and go to expensive places more often. Don't be afraid. If a girl wants to grow up and become a woman, she has to be more ruthless to herself." Zhong Huiyan snorted and nodded vigorously to cheer for herself. She struggled to balance the big backpack behind her and walked towards the cold and bleak end of the long street. Out on the long street that was somewhat bleak because of the cold wind in winter, the flow of people didn't significantly decrease. It was just that most of the people on the street turned up their collars and hurried along, which made it less noisy. The large light screens in front of the high-end luxury department stores, like most of the light screens on the street, were muted during the day according to the noise regulations of the Federation. All the light screens played different news images or advertisements, but they had one thing in common, which was that there was a clear portrait at the bottom right corner. This portrait appeared in all the programs produced by the TV stations, constantly reminding all the people of the Federation. Not many pedestrians on the street would deliberately look up to look at the portrait. It was not because they had lost interest in this major event due to the pressure of their lives, but because they had seen that face too many times in the past few years. They did not need to memorize anything to be able to accurately recognize that seemingly ordinary face in the crowd. However, in the past, the people remembered this face because he was the most famous war hero of the Federation, the successor personally chosen by the war god, or partly because of the national scandal. But now, they remembered this face because that person was a spy of the royal family of the Imperium. There were wanted posters everywhere. Su Lu withdrew his gaze, turned up his collar to cover the side of his face, and continued to walk in the direction of Linyuan. Everything in front of him really gave him some kind of illusion, as if he was running for president of the Federation, and the financial group behind him bought countless advertisements to promote him. However, he felt that the standard portrait used by the Federation made him look too stupid. There was no wanted poster of Huai Chaoshi. It seemed that the Federation government didn't want the ordinary people to know for the time being that the princess of the Imperium, who had been arrogant in the rumors among the people for several years, had actually come to the Federation. This might be to stabilize the social order and avoid unnecessary panic, or it might be a conservative decision made by the government to avoid being the target of the angry people in the future. Thinking about these questions, Su Lu was a little distracted, and in front of the luxurious Silver Spirit car store, he bumped into a passionate couple. At this moment, a gust of winter wind blew by out of nowhere, lifting a corner of his hat. "Sorry." Su Lu very naturally apologized, pulled down the brim of his hat, and then found that the young man of the couple was staring at him in shock. The atmosphere on the street suddenly became a little strange, and the people who were hurriedly walking subconsciously stopped and looked over, as if they weren't confident that the face they just saw was the person they imagined. Su Lu knew that he had to leave immediately, but at this moment, the young man bravely protected his girlfriend behind him, summoned the courage to shout with a trembling voice, "The Imperium! He's from the Imperium!" The people on the street suddenly became excited, and the people who were closer nervously pulled their companions to retreat to the periphery, as if the man in the hat was a man-eating beast, and the people in the distance shouted loudly, "Call the police! Catch that Imperium person!" These people were only the most ordinary people of the Federation, and although this was a rich district, the rich ordinary people were still ordinary people. Their courage could support their shouting, but it couldn't support them to enforce the arrest rights of citizens like a certain beautiful man. None of the people dared to rush up. The young man who discovered Su Lu seemed to have used all his courage to pull his girlfriend behind him and shout those words, and under the gaze of the calm eyes under the brim of the hat, he was so scared that he couldn't move his legs. Su Lu looked at the brave young man in front of him, said nothing and did nothing. He smiled bitterly and sighed in a low voice. "So, the Imperium people don't even have a name." He had already started to move quickly, walking out of the crowd, and he believed that no one would dare to block his way. As for whether or not there would be hidden weapons like stools and leather bags coming at him from behind, it wouldn't affect him in any way. There was a whistling sound on the street, and a twin-arm rotary jet-armed helicopter was approaching at a high speed. Su Lu glanced at it from the corner of his eyes and vigilantly found that the Small Eyes combat force had expanded to all the streets, and their reaction speed had reached a terrifying level. Su Lu began to run, and the corner of the antique building and the shallow traces of running water came into his eyes. Through the analysis of his brain and his own ability, he immediately calculated a feasible walking trajectory. His right foot stepped on the red fire hydrant, and his body shook diagonally, flying over the heads of the crowd. When he was about to hit the wall, his muscles suddenly relaxed, and he stuck to the wall as if he had installed a hydraulic device. Almost at the same time when he was close to the wall, his fingers dug into the shallow traces of the cement wall, and his feet kicked the ground, and he quickly climbed 5 meters to the 3rd floor. Then, he kicked the wall with both legs, and his right hand accurately found the corner of the antique building that protruded from the wall. His body suddenly contracted and bounced in the air, and with the momentum of the rebound, he forcibly moved 5 meters horizontally, crossing the street with a whoosh, and rushed into another building and disappeared. From the ground to the 3rd floor, and then crossing the street, all of Su Li's movements were smooth and rhythmic, clean and clear. The people who tried to stop or intimidate him had just raised their heads, and they only had time to see the figure strangely shuttling through the exterior of the building at high speed, and then disappear. The crowd on the street fell into collective silence, and thinking of that figure, they had extremely complicated feelings. The brave young man tightly held his girlfriend's hand, and his whole body was covered in sweat. The armed helicopter that came at high speed from the corner of the street was still on the street, as if it had never moved. He had to reorganize the map and the operation procedures again. In a dark room in a certain building, Su Li pulled out the electronic map in his bracelet, frowned, and used his finger to draw a few curved lines between the suburban Linyuan and his current location. He felt a little strange at this time, not only because of the reaction of the ordinary people of the Federation after seeing him, but also because of the increasingly fast reaction speed of the small I-Combat unit. But on the contrary, he always felt that the glory of the charter was not as scary as he thought. Because the old thing was dead, the Federal Central Computer had become a cold machine, a tool in the hands of humans, so its ability could not be fully utilized. Unlike the old moon, there was still some thin air on New Moon base. Although it was not enough to support human breathing, it was very spectacular to watch the rise of Planet S1 from here. Many powerful people in the Federation often chose to come here for vacation, just to watch the sunrise of Planet S1. At the edge of the perpetually dark back of New Moon, a worn-out spaceship that couldn't be more worn out was silently watching Planet S1 bathed in the light of the stars. This spaceship, which looked like a pile of metal garbage cans, was very different from the original 3-winged spaceship in terms of performance and appearance. The spaceship that crossed the galaxy at a terrifying speed that was unimaginable to humans was full of craters from the impact of meteorites, but there were no signs of it falling apart. What was even more strange was that the few sophisticated military satellites of the Federation that were very close to this worn-out metal spaceship did not send out any warnings, as if this spaceship did not exist. Chapter 824. Like a ghost, the broken spaceship quietly floated in the shadow of the new moon, silently watching the light on Planet S1. The light of the distant star penetrated the thin atmosphere of the planet in front of it and shrouded the spaceship with a layer of strange colors. It was not modeled, but more like the most clumsy graffiti of a young man who had just stepped onto the streets. The great mechanical life was resurrected and returned to its hometown, but it had lost the glorious coat that was once everywhere and was confined to the small space of this broken spaceship. Then, could it still be as omnipotent as before? The dark and messy metal components that looked like garbage cans were stacked on the outer shell of the spaceship. In fact, the materials were all special alloys that made the Bermuda businessman drool. They were extremely sturdy. No one knew that in the deepest part of these alloy boxes, in the central control room of the tri-winged spaceship, there was a voice that kept echoing in the empty space. This voice was sometimes angry, sometimes sad, and sometimes dull. When angry, it was loud and clear. When sad, it was sweet and gentle. When dull, it was low and turbid. There were no gender characteristics. This is mine. This is all mine. Why don't you let me in? Even you should be mine. Why don't you let me in? I want to go in. He didn't know why the old thing who called himself Xiao Fei was so angry, but he kept repeating the words in a fit of pique like a child. His voice echoed in the central control room, sharp and hurried. On the light screen at the front of the spaceship, which was only the size of 2 human palms, showed a very strange picture. Among the countless green light spots, there was a dark green data stream. In fact, there was no difference between these green symbols made by the mechanical language. It was just that the density of the green data stream from the tri-winged spaceship was extremely high, so the color was darker. And it seemed to have some kind of life, with a sense of joy and liveliness. This strange picture was actually just a description of the current war. Human society, including the employees in the Bureau of Proclamation building, did not know that this war was taking place. They did not know that the outcome of this war could change the direction of human history. Because of the symbiotic relationship between data, even the cold central computer in the Bureau of Proclamation underground might not have realized that it had been dragged into this war by an unwilling intelligence. Xiao Fei, or Philip, used the self-modified shipboard computer to connect with the surrounding information nodes. There was no need for the process of this battle to be shown on the light screen with the green data. There was no Su Lu in the tri-winged warship, and there was no human who needed to use their eyes to see the image, but Philip still insisted on doing so, because he, who could only control this tri-winged warship, had already fallen in love with this method of using his eyes to see the world, because it was very human-like, even if the eyes he used to look at the hologram were only two surveillance cameras with low precision. This silent war lasted for an unknown amount of time. The dark green data stream penetrated deeply into the boundless green light spots. The two sides snuggled up to each other intimately, but the data stream was unable to control the huge number of green light spots. Why is there no way to control them? Philip's sharp voice sounded again, full of anger and unwillingness. You useless machine. You icy cold iron coffin. You are just a corpse without a soul. And I am the soul. Why won't you listen to me? Are you willing to be a walking corpse? The sharp and harsh ridicule was mercilessly given to his former body, the powerful core computing center in the Bureau of Proclamation, and the glory of the charter that covered the entire star field. Beep your grandmother, bullying me just because you are big, Philip sighed bitterly. It had no way to control the federal central computer, but it could fully share all of the other parties' information without alerting the central computer. It could even use the countless nodes in the charter network to help it carry out path-based calculations. For the Federation, it had really become a ghost that could not be seen, touched, or affected. After some simple calculations and reasoning, it no longer felt useless and sad. It quickly entered the next step of the action plan. After all, although it did not think of itself as a computer, it was still a computer. Therefore, it could only allow itself to feel sad and sad occasionally, but it could not be sustained. The data stream on the small screen gradually sharpened into a clear picture of the surface of planet S1. Under the white clouds, on the shore of the blue sea, there were fields and residential roads, as well as the complicated streets of the capital's special district, until it could see the signboard of a certain expensive car dealership and a couple hugging on the side of the street. Countless pairs of eyes in the glory of the charter were tracking Su Lu, and then the latest information was summarized to the central computer in the Bureau of Proclamation. What Philip was doing was secretly standing behind the central computer, like a voyeur, observing everything at the same time without missing anything. Hey, this move is beautiful, I give you 10 points. The screen showed the picture of Su Lu climbing the outer wall of the building and running back at high speed. It was the first time Philip saw this face after waking up, and before he had time to sigh, he was severely shocked. The picture on the screen changed at a speed that was absolutely impossible for the human eye to see, which meant that the glory of the charter was using all the monitoring equipment in the building to carry out real-time tracking. However, the tracking picture lasted for less than 10 seconds inside the building, and it entered the basement for 3 seconds before it abruptly stopped. The central computer on the planet and Philip in the tri-winged spaceship lost sight of Su Lu at the same time. Damn. You are running too damn fast now, even I can't keep up with you. Philip's voice screamed exaggeratedly, and after a moment, it suddenly deepened. Lele, where are you going? It was a Sunday night. Zhou came to Linyuan according to her habit of many years. She came to the bamboo house, put the pink windbreaker beside her, and sat cross-legged in silence. Only a very small number of women could wear peach red, and dared to wear peach red. However, it was probably only a woman like her, whose face was as beautiful as the north wind outside the window, whose heart was growing stronger by the day, but who firmly maintained a certain gentleness, could wear peach red with an extraordinary feeling. The manager, who was familiar with her, stood by her side. He did not need to hand over the menu, as he had already prepared the dishes in advance. He was very clear about the recent major events in the Federation, so he was not surprised that the young lady's expression was colder than before, and he would not tactfully take out a certain year of red wine for her to taste. He just politely completed the necessary work and tactfully left the room in silence. It was still Linyuan, still the bamboo house beside the flowing water and fallen leaves, and still the same position. Through the window, she could still see the private jet taking off and landing under the white cliff, but there was one less person on the opposite side of the table. Although that guy was used to smiling quietly and did not speak much, especially when he showed his terrifying appetite, she was still not used to it. After thinking so much, Zoyu smiled. Recently, she knew some details of the military prison riot and guessed that it might be investigated by the government, but she did not regret it, because it was really interesting to see that guy tossing around so much. After eating steamed shad and 3 glasses of special rice wine, she was a little tired. As usual, she held her chin and leaned on the table tiredly, and then saw a very subtle handwriting on the side of the table. Zoyu was stunned for a long time, and then a slightly bitter smile appeared on her lips. She muttered to herself, "Both of them are so cautious and careful, and have prepared everything in advance. They are really brother and sister." She took out the eyebrow-trimming tweezers from her dressing bag. Her eyebrows were slightly knitted, but the tip of the tweezers did not touch her eyebrows. Instead, it fell on the table, and under the cover of sleepiness, she wrote a few numbers. In the middle of the night, Su Lu once again sneaked into the Linyuan. After silently memorizing the row of numbers that represented the precise geographical location, his fingers slowly moved across the table. With a light rustling sound, a thin layer of precious would suddenly disappear from the table. What was once written there, no one would know. In the early morning, Su Lu once again escaped from the capital. Following the road that led to the back of Macho Mountain, under the cover of the darkest night, he crossed the fields and small streams, and turned west at the foot of the mountain. He pulled out the electronic map in his bracelet and confirmed that the pipeline in the hills was marked on the map. It was an underground tunnel that was specially built by HTD Bureau for the vagrant toads to lay eggs. With difficulty, he crawled through the narrow and long pipeline, pushed aside the weeds in front of him, stood up in the morning light, and looked back at the electronic fence in the distance. Su Lu was sure that the Federal Central Computer did not notice that someone had entered the wildlife sanctuary. Following the coordinates on the map, he walked into the depths of the sanctuary. Along the way, he passed by many tidal flats and wetlands formed by the water of Macho Lake. Occasionally, he would see a few early insects that were fighting with the condensed dew. Looking at the tiny and touching pictures, the weird feeling in Su Li's heart grew more and more intense. He felt that the abilities that the radiance of the charter had shown in the past few days were far less than what he had predicted. Was it really because the soulless central computer of the Federation was like the dew on a leaf that was frozen by the cold wind, and could only accept the teasing of insects clumsily and passively? If that was really the case, then he was very confident that he could win this war. Especially after leaving Planet S1, the charter's positioning time would be affected by the long distance. Just as he was thinking about these things, Su Lu arrived at the destination of his trip. Then he saw a very shocking scene. The core area of the wildlife sanctuary was an area of shallow grass. The early morning sun slanted through the morning fog, making the water in the water reflect a pearl-like luster. In the middle of the wetland, there was a slope. On the slope, there was a tree. In the winter, all the leaves had fallen, leaving only dead branches, proudly standing in the middle of the yellow grass. Under the tree was the princess of the empire who was being hunted down by the Federation. Huai Chaosher leaned against the withered tree with her head lowered, reading a book. Her expression was as calm as usual. Chapter 825. If I didn't make a mistake, this would probably be the best work of 2010. The title is very flashy, but that's what Andy Lau said. I just used it to attract attention. All I wanted to say and could say was thank you. Does that count as deserving of the title? Of course it does, because that's what I think, and you all think so too. This has nothing to do with narcissism, and it has nothing to do with the phrase, no one is the best in literature. In my opinion, this is the attitude that every person who makes a living by writing should have. You have to think that you write well before you can write what others think is well written. Friends who don't think so are also good friends. I sincerely hug you, and hope that the next book will make you think so, because I will definitely write better and better. I have confidence and attitude about this. Looking at it from a different angle, writing a novel was also a type of work that required proficiency. Apart from some talents that I was quite envious of, the rest was nothing more than hard work, bad writing skills, constant practice, and familiarity with reading thousands of books. There were also a lot of 6th and 7th words that I wouldn't list. Of course, it's not pure. I've liked to write since I was very young. I was often praised for my essays in elementary school, but I loved to write even more in middle school. After that, I was never praised again. This was because my Chinese language representative was really talented. I was very envious, jealous, and hateful. I started writing in high school and even took my weekly journal seriously. But unfortunately, my high school Chinese language representative was also really fucking talented. I was even more envious, jealous, and hateful. When I went to university, I was still writing, and then I realized that what I loved the most in life was writing, so I kept writing after that. I wrote a lot, and a lot of words were burned long ago. Along with the hard drive, there were also some that I hid, because they were really ugly. Babies don't know how to walk when they are born, and no one knows how to write when they are born. It's best not to show off the early photos of wearing open-crotch pants. I practiced a little, so the things I wrote can be sold for money, can be used, and can continue to write, which is very good. As for my 2 language representatives, they haven't been doing this for many years. One of them was still lamenting about it when we were talking about it 2 years ago. Of course, they earn more money than me, but they can still type on the keyboard every day, so I feel that I am happier in this aspect. I'm a little tired. I'm going to sleep. Other than thanking you, there's nothing else I can do. I just have to seriously write every single story. I shrug my shoulders. Just like today's 3rd chapter, I'm very satisfied. Then, there was the promise that I made in the past. Until I die or am too old to write anymore, I will continue to write and write stories for everyone to read. I'll try my best to write until you're sick of it. Then, I'll show it to your future generations. I'll make a lot of money. Chapter 8:26. Sulu walked towards the tree. Huai Chaoshu heard the sound of footsteps, but she didn't turn around. She picked up her book and stood up from under the tree. Sulu was silent for a moment, and then he said, "Actually, I'm a bit surprised. Why did you choose this place?" Huai Chaoshu turned around and calmly looked at him. A sincere smile appeared on her usually cold and detached face. However, this sincere smile appeared on the face of this terrifying highness. It really was a bit hard to get used to. Since I dared to come to the Federation, it naturally wasn't just because I dared. I also made some preparations beforehand. The morning fog nestled against the wetland and slowly moved. It seemed thin, but when layered together, it was enough to block the military satellite surveillance from outside the atmosphere. This was the core area of the wildlife reserve, the area where the Federation's surveillance was the weakest. Sulu withdrew his gaze from the depths of the morning fog and looked at her with a smile. He didn't know what he should say. Sensing his current complicated emotions, Huai Chaoshu paused for a moment, and then continued with a smile. However, the density of the Federation's surveillance still far exceeded my expectations. If it wasn't for the help that woman of yours gave us, which also far exceeded my expectations, I really don't have the confidence to stay here for long. Sulu knew that she was referring to Zhou Yu and that little blue instrument. He scratched his head and explained, "She's not my woman." After saying this, the two of them sank into silence again. The atmosphere under the tree became a bit strange, or perhaps awkward. Regardless of whether it was Sulu or Huai Chaoshu, neither of them were people with extraordinary emotional intelligence like Shi Qinghai. They didn't know what they should say, what kind of topic they should choose to bring this morning fog conversation onto the right track. From a certain perspective, Sulu and Huai Chaoshu were extremely familiar with each other. They had spent a lot of time together in the Empire, participating in intense debates and those terrifying gambling games. They even fought side by side during the rebellion, playing out scene after scene of mythical mecha battles in that ocean-like mulberry forest. However, this kind of familiarity was between enemies. Regardless of whether it was him or Huai Chaoshi, neither of them forgot the electronic explosives planted on his body by the intelligence agency, as well as those cruel punishments. If it wasn't for those twists and turns and coincidences, back then, Sulu would have killed the other party at all costs. Huai Chaoshi was the same. Moreover, in that white courtyard they had both tried it before. And now, they were going to admit their relationship? Sulu thought of what Huai Chaoshi had said in the snow beside the military prison in Qingqing. His gaze couldn't help but become somewhat perplexed and helpless. He had been lonely for many years after losing his family when he was young. It was as if he had just slept, and when he woke up, he found that he had an older sister in the distant universe, and it was very likely that he would have many more relatives. Waking up with a start from a dream and instantly entering another strange dream was a mental shock that not everyone could accept immediately. Even he, who had the thickest nerves, was silent for a long time. Therefore, he asked a question that seemed particularly clumsy in this tense situation. "What book are you reading?" Huai Chaoshi didn't answer. She turned her wrist and turned the cover around. On it was the name of the book, Love in the Charter Era. Sulu scratched his head and sighed. "You're the princess of the Empire. The people in the Federation who want you dead are countless times more than the people who want me dead. Yet, you're actually interested in reading a romance novel? This is a literary novel." According to the introduction, the author once won the Nebula Award. Huai Chaoshi calmly corrected him. "I still have some difficulties in reading the Federation language, but that doesn't stop me from seeing a lot of metaphors in this novel." The author used the fear and resentment towards the glory of the Charter as a carrier of love. "It's very brilliant and wonderful. You've lived in the Federation for so many years, yet you haven't read this novel. I'm very surprised. I think you need to strengthen your plan in the humanities in the future. Generally speaking, those who stand outside the wall can easily find metaphors from the meaningless missions done by those who are inside the wall." Sulu argued. He didn't notice that he was still subconsciously standing in the Federation's position. Huai Chaoshi smiled mysteriously and didn't continue the topic. "I don't know how long I'll have to wait for you under this tree, so I prepared a few books. The Federation's reading experience is quite good. This is indeed better than the Empire's." Suli's eyes moved to the bottom of the tree and saw a thick stack of books. He could vaguely see the names of a few books. There was the Charter Chronicles and George Carlin's research. Noticing his puzzled expression, Huai Chaoshi explained, "Ever since I entered the Federation, especially the Capital Ring, I've observed a lot of details that prove the difference between the Baijin dynasty and the Federation. The Federation is very powerful. To defeat such a powerful enemy, one must first understand the enemy. These folksy books that the intelligence agency doesn't really care about are very good research materials in my opinion." After pausing for a moment, she looked into Suli's eyes and said, "Of course, now that the one who understands the Federation the most has appeared in the Baijin dynasty, you will be in charge of these matters from now on." This highness tone was calm and normal, as if she was saying that it was his turn to wash the dishes at home tomorrow, but Sulu understood what she was trying to say. The siblings under the tree in the morning fog were without a doubt the two people who believed in the simplest and most direct creed in the universe. As long as the initial awkward atmosphere was broken, their communication would become very simple and direct. That was why Sulu simply shook his head and didn't explain too much. Huai Chaoshi looked into his eyes quietly. There was no disappointment or anger as she said, "I know you don't have much feelings for the Empire. After all, you grew up in the Federation and received that rotten education. In your eyes, the Empire's system is primitive and backward, dictatorial and barbaric, so your unwillingness to serve the Empire should be a very real and instinctive reaction." It wasn't rotten education. Sulu looked back into her eyes and said, "I've been to the Federation. I've seen the Liban Star that is currently undergoing a reformation. I've also seen the lives of the Empire's lowly people like pigs and dogs, as well as the miserable scenes of tens of millions of rebel soldiers being crushed into minced meat. In my opinion, even though this Federation isn't perfect, to the extent where it is sometimes disgustingly dirty, no matter what, it is still a bit better than the left Sky Star region. Huai Caoshi's eyes narrowed, her gaze gradually becoming sharp. If a butcher puts on a mask of hypocrisy and changes the method of killing a pig from a knife to an electric shock, could it be that this proves that he isn't a butcher? Su Lu said in a low voice. Even if it is a pig, at the very least, it will die a bit more comfortably. This is an extremely small change, but it is actually an extremely important difference. Huai Caoshi stared into his eyes and slowly put her hands behind her back. She turned around and raised her head to look at the indiscernible end of the morning fog. Calming down her emotions, she said in a low voice, "If you value this change so much, then all the more you should come home with me. Only in this way can you complete this change." Su Lu followed her gaze and looked into the depths of the morning fog, not knowing what was there. After a moment of silence, he replied, "I know myself very well. I know that I absolutely don't have the ability to change that star region." On the other side of the morning fog is the electronic wall. Huai Caoshi said, "When I first came in contact with this information, I found it hard to understand. The people of the Federation built such a long electronic wall. Why exactly? Did they want to turn humans into monkeys in a zoo for the wild beasts to watch? Later, when I found out that these electronic walls were to protect the wild beasts from being hunted down by humans, I was truly shocked. I really didn't expect that it was actually based on such a ridiculous reason." She did not hide the contempt and mockery on her face at all. Life can only advance through competition. The Federation thinks that they are protecting the ecology by doing this, but they are actually going against the laws of nature. How arrogant! The weak are prey to the strong. This is how it should be said in the language of the Federation, right? These wild beasts are not as strong as humans, so they should be eaten. Life is a process of constant elimination and selection. If this process is forcefully interfered with, in the end, it can only become the current Federation. After 10,000 years of development, there is actually no qualitative leap. It is just like the pool of stagnant water in front of you and me, without the slightest ripple. Huai Caoshi turned her head and looked coldly at Su Lu. Although the Empire is currently at a disadvantage, as long as it is not destroyed, in at most 30 years, it will be able to completely surpass the Federation. This is the reason. We eat meat and they eat compounds. How can we not win? Her voice was still indifferent and calm, and the language of the Federation was still somewhat stiff. However, these words, especially every word in the last sentence, carried an unquestionable sense of firmness when they were spat out from her thin lips. When they landed on the surface of the wetland, killing intent spread out, startling a few gulls and herons. White wings hid in the fog. A civet cat that was crouching by the pool for its morning drink looked down warily at the tree, then turned around and ran away in fear. Further away, a pride of lions in the long grass appeared to be somewhat restless. The male lion was biting the neck of the female lion, but he did not dare to take a step closer in this direction. I think it is progress for the strong to take the initiative to leave space for the weak to survive. Su Lu looked at her back that was thin but gave off an extremely strong feeling. After a moment of silence, he said, "Besides, the relationship between the social classes of human beings is not completely the same as the relationship between human beings and wild beasts. That's why I said that the education of the Federation is rotten. There has never been absolute equality in human society, not in the Empire, not in the Federation, not in the past, not in the present, and not in the future." Huai Caoshi turned around and looked at Su Lu expressionlessly. "Don't be too naive. Even the natural human rights that you often speak of are nothing but a joke in my eyes. Why can't the commoners learn the junqi that flows in our bodies? Because this is a gift that the Creator has only given to us. Do you think this is also equal? Don't tell me that the Lees of Philadelphia are also members of the royal family of the Empire." Su Lu subconsciously added, and then both he and Huai Caoshi fell into silence at the same time. This was because a similar conversation had once occurred on the Red Rose and in the Shanghai. At the time, Su Le had mocked and asked in the end if he was also a member of the royal family of the empire. The conversation was still the same as before, but the answer was completely different. We've discussed this question before. Su Li's eyes drooped slightly. Perhaps we are truly born to be the most powerful people in the universe, but this does not mean that we are born with some sort of special privilege. He pointed to the blue sky above the fog and said, "The charter computer is capturing me. It is stronger than me. Should I surrender to a computer? If I am not willing to be enslaved by it, why should I enslave others?" Chapter 8:27. Morning mist, wetlands, winter trees, siblings. In the distance, the snowy peaks of Macho's former mountains suddenly appeared from the mist, reflecting the morning sun from the east. It arrived on this slope and broke the long silence and inexplicably oppressive atmosphere. "How are you going back to the empire?" Su Le asked. Huai Chaoshi calmly looked at him and said without hesitation, "I'm going to take you back with me." He had asked about the method of returning to the empire, but she had answered about the state of returning to the empire. During this exchange, a certain emotion entered Su Li's body, making his heart contract slightly. His thick eyebrows rose slightly, and he said in a low voice of self-mockery, "Humanity's training, responsibility. Do you really expect me to go to the empire and become some crown prince, leading the imperial armies back to the Federation in the future?" Calmly looking at his slightly tanned and thin face, Huai Chaoshi suddenly said, "Actually, I really wanted to talk about a man's responsibility, because although I look like a man and have a man's temperament, in the end, I am not a man." Her eyes narrowed slightly, and her hands were behind her back. She looked around indifferently in the light of the morning. Her entire body exuded the unique dominance, or perhaps strength, of a man. For someone like her to say such a thing, it was not funny, but rather sad. "But I suddenly don't want to say it. I don't want to tell you how many people of the imperial family have died for this war, how many children my father and the other princes have sacrificed for the hero plan. I don't care if you are the last survivor of this plan, nor do I care what benefits you can bring to the empire in this war." She looked into Su Li's eyes and calmly said, "I only have you as a little brother. I must bring you back alive. For me, this is the most important matter." In the snowy forest outside Qingqing prison, Huai Chaoshi spoke more briefly, but the meaning she wanted to express was basically the same. Moreover, Su Le believed in the meaning and emotion she wanted to express. As the princess of the empire, crossing the river of stars to come to the Federation, no matter how great the benefits were, could not make up for the losses and risks she and the empire would suffer. Because he believed he was moved. Because he was moved and confused about his identity, Su Le had been slightly flustered. At this moment, standing under the winter tree in the wetland, he was moved again. He still couldn't call out that name, but Su Li's eyes became calmer and warmer. He thought that perhaps there was no reason in this universe, but perhaps some relationships were really precious. He looked at Huai Chaoshi and noticed that at some point, her hair had been dyed purple. He immediately thought that this was to conceal her identity as a member of the imperial family. But why was it purple? Shui has already dyed her hair black. Su Le smiled. Huai Chaoshi smiled and said, "Although she is my sister, she is not related to you by blood, so you don't have to be nervous." Going northwest from the wetland where the two of them were, following the source of the gentle swamp, passing through the entire reserve, climbing up the steep rock mountain, and skimming over the tranquil lake on the other side of the mountain, there was a balcony not far away in a straight line. In the early morning, Lady Tai, who had been woken up by an emergency phone call, stood on the balcony expressionlessly in her pajamas. Her eyes swept across the rippling water as she silently listened to the deep and powerful voice on the phone. The warm and moist air flow converged through some unknown method, making this early winter balcony exceptionally pleasant. "Madam, I have already indicated the possible identity of this person. If you insist on providing protection for him, then the government will have no choice but to take legal measures. This concerns the fundamental interests of the Federation, so I will not make any concessions." Hearing President Pabre's resolute voice, Lady Tai's expression didn't change. Her fingers gently slid over the railing, and after a long silence, she said, "Mr. President, if the government's intelligence system is still useful, then you should know very well that right now, this guest in the back of Macho Mountain, if he is really the person you guessed he is, then not only does he have a highly respected identity in the Empire, he is also the only pacifist in the upper echelons of the Empire. If you are truly considering the interests of the Federation, then how to treat him is a question worth pondering." "Madam, don't you think this is something that the Federation government needs to consider? I don't care if this person of the Empire is a pacifist or not. I only know that he is a great master of the Empire. No matter how you think about it, you personally receiving him is a very wrong choice. There is one point that I must explain clearly. I hope you also heard it very clearly." The winter lake wind blew onto the balcony and landed on Lady Tai's face. Although it was no longer biting cold, her expression was cold and indifferent. She said, "From the beginning to the end, I didn't know if he was a great master of the Empire. He is a member of the official diplomatic group of the Empire's resistance organization. He was personally recommended by Commander Mu to come to the back of Macho Mountain to negotiate the stability of the mining in Galaxy X. Did you hear it clearly?" she asked in a deep voice. There was no reply from the other end of the phone. President Pabre should be thinking or controlling his anger after his authority was wantonly challenged. Madam gently held the phone and asked, "During the election, you participated in the killing of my son. Fortunately, nothing happened to Ah Yuan. Now that this layer of paper has been exposed by Shi Qinghai and Su Lu, if you still try to use framing and violence to treat a taxpayer that should be respected, then I will turn you, your government, and all your ambitions into ashes." The way this sentence was put together was as direct and fierce as a woman in the marketplace. The content of the sentence was extremely tyrannical, and even had a crazy feeling of burning the autumn forest and destroying the world. However, it was said in such a calm and indifferent tone, which made it seem particularly terrifying. Without waiting for President Pabre to answer, Lady Tai directly hung up the phone indifferently. She walked into the building from the balcony and looked at the middle-aged man on the sofa who was fighting with the synthetic meat. Even she couldn't help but be blinked by the extremely bad taste of the Federation's famous brand combination and the beautiful face that couldn't be suppressed even with such bad taste. She slightly frowned and said with a bitter smile, "Did you sleep well last night?" The master took a tissue and wiped his shiny lips, looked at Lady Tai and said with a sigh, "That prince of ours must be dead. In the entire Federation, other than Madam, where else can I sleep well? Guest from afar, since you already know that your identity has been exposed, how can you still eat?" Lady Tai sat back in the chair, smiled and sipped the tea. With a very casual joke, she officially started the conversation. As the ultimate literature middle-aged man who loves peace and love, the most charming thing about the Federation is its protection of wild animals. The master picked up the fried synthetic meat on the plate and said seriously, "Although the taste of this meat is really terrible, I strongly support the idea of not killing, so I have to finish it to show respect to one of the predecessors in the 5-person group." Madam watched him swallow the piece of synthetic meat with difficulty, then said softly, "I'm very curious, why did you choose the Tai family? Nasri once said that in the Federation, only your family has enough magnanimity and courage to protect a poor foreigner." The master nodded politely to butler Jean who came to clean up the tableware, then looked at the madam and said miserably, "That prince of ours abandoned a poor person like me without hesitation, so I can only come to ask for your help." "Nasri? I've heard of this name before. It's his nickname in the Empire, right?" Lady Tai responded with a smile, but her right hand holding the chair couldn't help but bend and tremble slightly. "With the close friendship between you and their family, I'm not surprised that you know this name." The madam was silent for a moment, then smiled and said, "But even our Tai family can't protect a master of the Empire for a long time. You have to know that this is making the entire Federation an enemy. I don't want the foundation of the Tai family to be destroyed by the anger of the public. Madam, on the way here, I've already discussed with Mr. Mu En. In the future, I will become the spiritual teacher of the underground resistance group and support them on a spiritual level to fight against the Baijin royal family. With my special position in the empire, the Federation should let me live, right? The master opened his eyes like a child and looked at her face pitifully. Even with Lady Tai's shrewdness, she couldn't help but be shocked when she suddenly heard this sentence. She said in disbelief, "You want to break ties with the empire's royal family? My ancestors seem to have done this kind of thing often. Of course, it's mainly on a spiritual level. After that, I didn't see any strong opposition from the Baijin royal family, so it shouldn't be a big deal to do it occasionally." Lady Tai smiled bitterly and said, "Even I can't believe it." Do you think the Federation government will believe it? Just like hearing your fluent and precise Federation language, how can I believe that you didn't specially learn it before coming to the Federation? Our family is full of geniuses. I've heard that the brains of our ancestors even have the terrifying ability to copy memories. As for the Federation language, I often studied Master Schiller's wonderful works in the Empire, so I have some understanding of the language, so this isn't difficult. Master Fan said proudly. When he thought about how Lady Tai had rejected his request to protect him for a long time, his expression became extremely gloomy. Suddenly, he became spirited and said, "Madam, is it convenient to arrange a meeting between me and Mr. Tai Zion? Although that child has already passed his coming-of-age ceremony, I'm still in charge of dealing with people of your status. If you have any requests, you can tell me." Lady Tai gently placed the teacup on the table and said casually, but the scene instantly fell into a dead silence. She knew better than anyone else in the Federation what kind of status and ability this seemingly crazy great teacher of the Empire had. Since they were going to negotiate, then someone had to start raising conditions. Master Fan smiled slightly and looked at her. He shook his head and said with a sigh, "It's a pity. My ancestor has left an order that it's strictly forbidden to negotiate with any woman. She's not to be trifled with." Lady Tai was slightly stunned. She didn't expect the other party to refuse to negotiate with her. She frowned slightly and said, "According to the records I know, the first ancestor of your Hua family that appeared in the Empire was a woman." Master Fan smiled slightly and didn't explain. Lady Tai also smiled. She picked up the teacup and took a sip. She sighed and shook her head. Then she said to Butler Jean beside her, "This tea called Xianer Mei is pretty good. We'll use it in the afternoon tea party. Also, have Shenli inform the President's office that the Crystal Mining Consortium will allow the government to invest funds and that the profits from the mines will be distributed according to proportion." Master Fan's smiling face suddenly became calm and solemn. He calmly looked at the woman holding the teacup. Lady Tai had told him two things in this short conversation. One was a small matter of drinking tea, and the other was a heaven-shaking action that could change the Federation's situation for thousands of years. She told him these two things at the same time, but it just so happened that he felt it was a matter of course. "I'm impressed. This is the true meaning of lifting something heavy as if it were light." He looked at Lady Tai and praised sincerely, "And the conversation on the balcony just now, I have to say that your president is definitely not your match." Chapter 828. It was not an exaggeration to say that the crystal mines were the lifeline of the Federation. The power of intergalactic space travel all depended on them. If there was a problem with the supply of crystal mines, even with the glory of the Charter, the Federation would definitely collapse and fall apart. As for the energy required for the main cannons of the battleships, it was completely negligible. From the mining of mineral stars to the purification of fine craftsmanship to the standard design of crystal engines, the Macho family had always controlled all the core processes related to the Federation. This was the huge return that the Tai dynasty had obtained when they gave up their power by force. It was because of this that the Tai family of the Macho family was always able to have a transcendent position in the Federation. In addition to other hidden forces that had never surfaced, they were always the true leaders of the seven families. While chatting over tea, Lady Tai casually decided to give up some of her exclusive rights. Although she would definitely lay down countless foreshadowing during the specific process of opening up to the Federation, She would definitely not give up the lifeline of her family just like that. However, this decision was still enough to shock the entire Federation and even affect the left Sky Star region. Such a woman was definitely worthy of the great teacher's evaluation. You flatter me. An orphan and a widow being forced into such a situation by the Federation. How is it easy? I just have to be easy. Lady Tai had a mysterious smile on her face. She looked at the great teacher and said, "As for the conversation on the balcony, I'm not afraid that you will make fun of me. I've always believed that the most direct method is the most effective method. When the situation allows me to maintain my poise, I might as well maintain it perfectly. When I can't, I can only use my knife. I can be elegant, but I can also be a shrew. As long as what I do is worthy of the family name I've been given after marriage." The great teacher leaned forward slightly and respectfully said, "Madam is a traditional woman. I admire you very much. I also admire myself for this." Lady Tai looked at him with a smile, but she sighed in her heart. She had mentioned that the most effective method was to be direct and that the so-called poise was to remind the other party. However, this beautiful middle-aged man of the Empire did not respond at all. In this situation, he was still unwilling to state his own conditions. After thinking for a moment, she asked politely, "Do you have a daughter?" "I heard that Mr. Tai Zion already has a fiancée," the great teacher replied with a smile. Lady Tai smiled bitterly, not hiding the deep regret on her face. The government special forces have surrounded all the exits of the park. Secretary Shen walked behind the madam and looked at the man who was walking out of the garden along the path by the lake. He said softly, "This great teacher shouldn't be able to escape." Lady Tai said calmly, "You came to this conclusion because you don't know what the words great teacher mean in the Empire." Shen Li frowned slightly, not understanding what his wife meant. Suddenly, his pupils constricted as he stared at the strange scene. He was so shocked that he couldn't regain his senses for a long time. The great teacher who was walking out of the garden by the lake suddenly slanted his body and stepped on a fallen leaf on the lake with the tip of his foot. He swayed lightly like a water bird dancing gracefully on the surface of the water. In the blink of an eye, he had moved more than 10 meters toward the Winter Mountain on the other side of the lake. The badly matched Federation name tag on the man from the Empire was shining under the morning light. Mixed with the ripples on the lake, it was hard to look at him directly. Secretary Shen opened his mouth wide and his body was abnormally stiff. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. It was cold in winter, but the Macho Lake never froze. Even if there were a few thin pieces of ice on the surface of the lake, how could it carry such a heavy person? Could it be that the Empire's man could really defy the laws of physics and walk on the lake? When the floating figure disappeared into the forest on the other side of the lake, Secretary Shen couldn't help but believe it. He subconsciously looked at the lake, but other than a few faint ripples, there was nothing strange. Lady Tai calmly looked at the lake and waved her hand. Shen Li wiped the sweat on his forehead and left to deal with the government's problem outside the garden. He might not be stronger than Professor Jean, but he might not be as strong as the army god. Butler Jean said respectfully, "It's hard to find someone stronger than the Li brothers, but when it comes to the ingenuity of using it, who could be better than the Empire's great master Fan?" Lady Tai looked at the lake and sighed with mixed feelings. The Hua family is indeed full of geniuses. Before the old master left, I went to Feiqing City to visit him and learned more about him. According to his analysis, the so-called Ba Dao Zhen Qi should be the innate ability of the Empire's great master Fan Hua family. The Empire's Baijin royal family was just lucky to have a marriage with the Hua family, so they were able to share a part of the Hua family's power. It's a pity that the current great master Fan Hua didn't want to propose any conditions. Otherwise, if a Yuan could have a child with a girl from the Hua family, then the 10,000 years curse of the Tai family would be able to end. Butler Jean looked at his wife's side profile and said worriedly, "Young master's health is not bad these years. There are always too many worries in the near future." Lady Tai ignored Butler Jin's hidden persuasion and said, "Ask a Yuan to come back from S2. If this great master Fan Hua can escape from the government, arrange for them to meet." Of course, the Hua family was full of geniuses, or else they wouldn't have helped the Huai family become the emperor of the Zhuotian galaxy. The previous great master Fan Hua couldn't have taught two terrifying students like Li Pifu and Feng Yu, and the current great master Fan wouldn't have dared to kidnap the princess of the empire and try to overthrow the emperor. Great master Fan Hua was sometimes crazy, sometimes wretched, and sometimes artistic, but under his perfect shell, there was a terrifying ability and wisdom. Other than the glory of the Charter of the Federation and his little senior brother who never played by the rules, he didn't care about anyone. For such a great figure to follow the diplomatic mission to the Federation's capital ring, there was naturally a reason. It wasn't just to retrace the path his father had taken, nor was it just to experience the people of the Federation and find Schiller's unwarranted tombstone to shed tears of literature. Huai Chaoshi was here to save her brother, but the great master Fan Hua's goal was to save the entire universe. A person talking about saving the entire universe was too grand and unreasonable, but he was the only one in the universe who dared to say such a thing, and this idea was very much in line with his belief that he loved literature, peace, and only love. From the great master Fan's point of view, whether it was the Empire or the Federation, the people's emotions were hard to change, but they were still under the control of the higher-ups. Unfortunately, Emperor Fuchai and the Federation's Pabre government were both extremely tough people, and there was no possibility of persuading them. Thus, he set his sights even further. For the Empire, he had been trying to influence Huai Chaoshi, and now there was Su Lu. As for the Federation, he began to pay attention to Emo Chao's back mountain, not because of her superior position in the Federation, but because the heir of the Tai family was running for state council. The great master Fan Hua Manor had dealt with the Empire's royal family for countless years and had never suffered a loss, so he was extremely experienced. As for the Tai family's thoughts, the great master Fan Hua's guess was very accurate. The Tai family was no longer willing to continue hiding behind the scenes, and that young state council member called Tai Ziyuan was climbing step by step to the top of the Federation's political power. The great master Fan Hua didn't mind waiting, but he wanted to communicate with that young council member in advance. Especially after talking with that madam, he was even more certain that the young council member would become the Federation's president in many years' time. This trip to Emo Chao's back mountain had already connected, and the other party didn't hand him over to the Federation government. The tip of the thread was already very beautiful, and the initial goal had already been achieved. As for how to weave this thread into a flower, that would be a matter for the future. Gliding down from the cliff, the tip of his foot stepped on a black bull's horn, causing the bull to raise its head and moo in confusion, but it didn't discover anything. Following that, another foot stepped on the thick back of another bull, bringing the great master Fan's figure through the white fog like a ghost. The thick morning fog was already showing signs of dispersing, and the slightly humid air hit him in the face. He, who was already in a good mood, wanted to sing at the top of his voice. He finally remembered that this wasn't the Empire where he dared to run naked on the streets, but the Federation that had the glory of the Charter. He forcefully suppressed the singing in his throat and continued to appear like a flower in the fog, drifting forward. Drifting past the frosty white grass in the wetlands, avoiding the soft wet feces on the gentle slopes, passing through the withered trees that looked like giant potted plums in the winter, looking at the sheep diligently eating grass in the distance, the wild boar sleeping soundly in its own hot feces under his feet, and listening to the mournful cries of the insects under the grass roots under the trees, the great master Fan really felt like he was floating in the air, and he praised endlessly in his heart. The environment of the Federation is indeed well protected. I'm actually liking that crappy computer more and more. This man who looked like a flower seemed to have some kind of amazing ability. He could sense the flow of the wind and the obstacles in front of him, and he could freely pass through them. However, in the next moment, he suddenly bumped into something in the morning fog. With a muffled bang, he fell heavily to the ground. Covering his bleeding nose, the great master Fan crawled up from the ground in a hurry. He spat out a few mouthfuls of fresh mud mixed with blood, feeling very lucky that his mouth was not stained with any animal feces. Then, he glared at the fog in front of him furiously and thought, what the fuck is this thing that's so hard? The fog dispersed, and a man with a cigarette in his mouth pushed out a broken cart. The cart was very old and had only 3 wheels left, but it was very sturdy. Some things that seemed to have just been dug out of the mud were piled up in the metal carriage. It was hard to tell the age of the man with the cigarette in his mouth. His face was somewhat weathered, and the teeth that were biting the cigarette were black and yellow. They were very damaged. An old man pushing a cart? The great master fan stared at the guy. Suddenly, his pupils shrank sharply, overlapping this face with the face from many years ago. A miserable roar came out from his throat. "Nasri, you son of a bitch! Where the hell did you steal my boat?" Chapter 829. For some reason, the fog that had gradually thinned out by the rising sun had thickened again. However, it was still enough to see the man walking out of the fog. He wore an ordinary dark-colored coat and sturdy dark blue overalls. A string of tools that sounded like wind chimes hung behind his hips. His weathered face hid his age. Only his yellowish-black teeth clearly indicated his identity. This was because this man had many important identities. In this life, he had fought against the glory of the Charter and had a myriad of incarnations. It was unknown which one he would use today when he suddenly appeared in the wetlands. The most wanted criminal of the Federation, Mechanic Yu Feng, the younger brother of war god Li Pifu, Professor Jean of the Second People's Hospital, the spiritual teacher of the anti-government army, George Carlin, or the boss of the Donglin repair shop. Feng Yu pushed the broken car away and reached his hands to his tight buttocks to wipe off the mud. With a cigarette in his mouth, he replied in a muffled voice, "Ship? Of course, I dismantled it a long time ago. Otherwise, how am I supposed to make those damned reference chips?" Hearing this casual and matter-of-fact reply, the great teacher's handsome face suddenly blushed. Naturally, it was not because of shyness but because he was extremely agitated. Back then, his father doted on this little disciple the most and even gave him the family's most important spaceship. In the end, it was dismantled. The great teacher took a deep breath. As his body trembled, his hair stood on end, revealing the white flowers that indicated his true age. They were like the white reeds in the wetlands. With an extremely sorrowful and indignant scream, his body suddenly leaned forward, breaking through the thick fog in front of him and pouncing towards the opposite side. Because his speed was too shocking as the fog scattered, it was as if countless afterimages could be seen in the air, like countless flowers blooming. Feng Yu's expression did not change in the slightest. He was still holding the burning cigarette between his lips, but his feet had silently sunk into the mud. The string of tools behind his buttocks that made a ringing sound suddenly became incomparably quiet for some reason. Countless muffled sounds rose and fell in the wetlands. The great teacher, whose body was distorted in the air, was like countless streaks of light as he continuously attacked at high speed. However, in the next moment, the countless afterimages in the air suddenly fused together and then fell heavily onto the wet and soft ground. In the morning fog, a powerful fist slowly retracted. Feng Yu's countenance instantly turned from pale to normal. He looked coldly at the great teacher, who was unable to stand up, and said with a slightly hoarse voice, "After so many years, you still haven't learned that you must be ruthless in a fight. You have great capabilities but are extremely cowardly. You can't bear to hurt others, so you can only let others hurt you. Looks like I have to teach this good-for-nothing son of yours a lesson on behalf of Master. He's always like a woman, what kind of ability can he have?" Master Fan was lying on the wet ground in grief and indignation. Feng Yu took 2 steps forward. Just as he was about to strip the man naked and hang him on a tree to vent his anger for his teacher, he suddenly heard a cold and powerful voice coming from the thick fog. Who said that women don't have the ability? This voice, which came from the depths of the morning fog, instantly woke up all the living creatures in the wetlands. The light milky-colored fog rustled and fled into the air in fear. The shivering frost grass quickly lowered their thin bodies that were frozen. A figure came charging out from the light fog. His feet stepped on the grass as if he was stepping on a big drum, making vibrating sounds. It was as if he was only slightly slower than the speed of sound. He was like a clap of thunder with majestic power. Without saying a single word, he flipped his arm and smashed it toward Feng Yu's body. It was simple and direct, without any fancy moves. Feng Yu's pupils shrank slightly. He crossed his hands and went up to the figure. He had already expected this encounter, but he really didn't expect that the other party would come so quickly and so fiercely. It was even more powerful than he had imagined. It even made him feel a sense of danger that he hadn't felt for many years. Fist collided with fist, knuckles rubbed against knuckles. Suddenly, the air wave violently spread in the thick fog of the wetlands. The confrontation between the two people didn't make any sound, but the power was as terrifying as a fiery missile. The fog was shaken in an instant, and the surroundings were dark. However, there was a clear space of about 50 meters in radius. The air between heaven and earth seemed to be burning. The two figures flew away as soon as they came into contact. The hard hiking boots with ox tendon soles plowed a deep mark on the wet and soft mud. Feng Yu steadied himself and slowly took the cigarette from the corner of his mouth. He bent his finger and flicked it into the distance in the deep fog. He narrowed his eyes and looked at the young woman in front of him. The corner of his mouth was slightly raised with a trace of ridicule. He said in a hoarse voice, "The blood of the Hua family and the Huai family of Bai Yen have indeed bred a monster in this generation." He coughed softly twice, and his right hand behind his waist trembled slightly. Huai Chaosher looked at him expressionlessly and said, "It's not that I'm very strong. It's that you Nasri are old." There was still a misty fog around the wetlands. Only here the morning fog was completely dispersed, and the winter tree on the gentle slope was very clear. Su Lu stood silently under the winter tree, looking at the man who was coughing nonstop. He suddenly said, "Uncle, long time no see." Feng Yu covered his mouth with his fist. He looked up at the tree and said with a smile, "Little guy, long time no see." Su Lu walked slowly from under the tree. He passed by Huai Chaosher and came to him. He focused on the face that he hadn't seen for a long time. He looked at the familiar face of the wind and frost for a long time. It was so long that all the complicated emotions in his heart were forced to become indifferent. Then he asked calmly, "Aren't you dead? Then why don't you die? Why don't you die?" It was a very ridiculous tone, but it clearly conveyed his truest emotions after experiencing so many things and discovering so many unbearable truths. Hearing this, Feng Yu frowned slowly. He didn't hide the anger and ridicule on his face. Su Lu stared into the uncle's eyes and said word by word, "I hate fucking people who use death to deceive me. I hate people who want to control my life the most. But you did 2 in a row. So I want to ask, why don't you die?" His voice was still calm and gentle, without any emotional fluctuation. Especially when he said the words, "fucking mother," the rhythm was particularly calm and peaceful, so he sounded more angry and lost. Feng Yu looked at the little guy who had grown up since childhood. He suddenly felt that his eyes were still so small and ridiculous, but some aspects had become a little strange. After a moment of silence, he said with slight ridicule, "Is this all you want to ask?" "Of course not. I do have some questions that I want to get answers from you," Su Lu replied. Feng Yu took out the cigarette case from his pocket. He wanted to smoke, but found that the cigarette case had been crushed by the impact of the energy just now. The cigarette inside had all scattered, like something from the past. He looked up at Su Lu and said, "It just so happens that I also have some questions that I want you to answer. You answer my questions first." Su Lu said without hesitation, "I'll ask first. I'll only let you ask if I'm satisfied with your answers." Feng Yu threw the cigarette case to the ground. He looked at him and said, "You're so rebellious. How dare you talk to me like this? I'll ask first. I'll ask first." Su Lu was unusually tough. He stared into his eyes and didn't budge an inch. Feng Yu was stunned. He confirmed that the guy in front of him was really not the little boy who wore dark goggles and was busy next door. Because of this recognition, he was extremely angry. He waved his arms and scolded, "You ate my food, used my food, and I taught you how to fix things. I taught you how to do things. Is this how you treat me now?" Su Lu was even angrier than him. Like a red-eyed bison, he shouted excitedly, "I fixed all the goods. I cooked all the food. I earned all the money. What the fuck have you done other than using the money I earned to visit prostitutes? Do you think it's still the same as before? I'll do whatever you want me to do? You want to see a policewoman's underwear? I'll play cute outside the window and make her squat down. You're too lazy to look for the brand? I'll go to the sanatorium to ask about the new goods recently. Then I'll be surrounded by a group of prostitutes. You want to eat beef? I'll fucking climb over the wall to kill the cow and cut the meat for you. You don't eat when you're old. You don't eat when there's too much blood. You don't eat when the red wine doesn't match. You don't eat when the sunset above the mine isn't beautiful. What the fuck do you want to eat? The great teacher and Huai Chaosher, who had just climbed up from the ground, stared blankly at Sulu, who was shouting like a red-hot stone. They couldn't help but be speechless. They thought to themselves, what the fuck is this? His childhood was too terrible. Who was the one who said that the Federation prioritizes human rights? In Feng Yu's imagination, when he appeared in front of Sulu again, it would definitely be a warm and sentimental reunion. That little boy would throw himself into his arms and listen to him tell him many awesome stories. Then he would be moved to tears. Who would have thought that it would be such a scene? Back in Donglin, Sulu had once guessed that the owner of his repair shop should be a master. Although Feng Yu was many times more powerful than Sulu had guessed, how could a guy who let his apprentices work to earn money for prostitutes be like a master? Feng Yu was at a loss for words. Suddenly he felt ashamed and angry. He jumped 3 meters high and roared back unreasonably, I'm your boss. I'm your teacher. Don't even think about denying this for the rest of your life. You don't even fucking respect your teacher anymore. Is there such a thing in the universe? Sulu stared at him and said in a deep voice, You've lied to me my whole life. What's the reason for that? In the midst of the wetland, there was a deathly silence. Uncle, I'm very strong now. Now, there's an even stronger person standing behind me. Sulu stood in front of Huai Chaosher, looked into Feng Yu's eyes and said, I think you should accept that the way we communicate has changed. I hope you can answer my questions honestly. Feng Yu laughed. His rotten teeth were particularly dazzling. He said mockingly, I really didn't expect that there would be someone in this universe who dares to threaten me. Huai Chaosher looked at him expressionlessly and said, That's because you haven't met anyone who can threaten you. Today, it's a coincidence that there are 3 of them. Master Fan suddenly said excitedly, Chaosher, he cheated on your father. Sulu, he played with you your whole life. As for me, he stole my family's boat. Everyone, shouldn't we beat him up first before we start chatting? Feng Yu's expression changed slightly. Then, he looked at Sulu very gently and said, It's not because you're very strong. It's because the little boy from back then has finally grown up. Let's start a manly conversation. He glanced at Huai Chaosher and said with a smile, Of course, you're more manly than a man. There's no need to argue. Sulu didn't smile. His expression was unusually calm. He stared at him and asked slowly, The mine accident that killed my whole family, was it you who did it? Chapter 830. The living Feng Yu was already a legend. From a certain point of view, he was even more legendary than his dead brother, Li Pifu. If his incredible deeds were gradually discovered by later generations after his death, the human society would immediately become as lively as it was at the beginning of the Big Bang. For such a person, it was probably extremely difficult to find an existence that could threaten him except for the glory of the Charter. However, the other 3 people in the morning fog of the wetlands seemed to have the ability to do so more or less, especially Huai Chaosher, who had unceremoniously proven her strength. Therefore, he had to be threatened. This was a very wonderful scene, one that had not appeared in the past 70 years. If the charter computer found these 4 people in the wetlands, it would not hesitate to shoot down the main cannon. More than half of the strong people in the universe would be wiped out, and it would be able to complete many of its historical missions. You know what I mean by family and mine disaster. Feng Yu looked at him with a trace of pity. The morning breeze blew his white hair. After a moment of silence, he replied seriously and calmly, It's not me. Hearing these 3 words, Sulu slightly raised his face. Looking at the sky that was still covered by fog, a relaxed smile appeared on his face. Probably because he had gotten rid of the deepest fear of these days, his body suddenly became relaxed and warm, as if he was soaking in warm water. Feng Yu's life was a life full of lies. No one would think that this legendary person would have such a bright temperament that disdained to lie. However, for some reason, just like when Sulu asked about the big explosion of the Empire before they met for the life and death contract in the mine, as long as he said no, he would believe him. Although he was a cold-blooded and despicable person, Sulu still believed him, or rather, was willing to believe him. Feng Yu's slender hands rummaged in the broken car for a long time. Like magic, he took out 2 bags of beef jerky, a bottle of red wine, and 4 crystal wine glasses that could be called handicrafts. Feng Yu slowly poured the red wine into 2 glasses and threw the rest to the great teacher. The great teacher took the wine and shook his head. Then he walked towards the winter tree with Huai Chaoshi. Master Fan sat against a withered winter tree. Huai Chaoshi stood silently under the tree. Sulu took the wine glass and stood in place. Feng Yu leaned against the broken car and sipped the red wine, letting out a sigh of satisfaction. He habitually touched his pocket and found that it was dry and empty. In front of him, Sulu took out a blue box of brand 37 cigarettes and handed it over. Feng Yu was slightly taken aback. He smiled and lit a cigarette. Then he raised the lighter in front of Sulu. Sulu thanked him and lowered his head to light the cigarette. He said in a low voice, "Let's talk about these trivial matters. After I came to Donglin, I investigated the mine disaster. It really didn't seem like an accident. It was too close to the residential area and too powerful." Biting the burning cigarette, Feng Yu's eyes pierced through the withered branches of the winter tree and the strange fog that did not disperse. He said, "According to my deduction, the mining accident may have been caused by one of the seeds of the Empire before you. The death of your foster parents and sister would be helpful for you to hide your identity more deeply." Sulu narrowed his eyes. He vaguely felt that there was something wrong with this deduction. However, he could not see where the problem was. His mood was slightly cold, so he took a deep drag on the cigarette. "With your personality, you definitely don't remember the last words I told you when we parted in the mine. One of them was to make you forget the words revenge." Feng Yu looked at him and said with a frown, "No one knows whether the seed that helped you hide your identity is your distant uncle or cousin. Furthermore, he either left this world because of normal birth, aging, illness, and death. Otherwise, he would have been purged by the Bureau of Proclamation and turned into a ghost. There is no point in you remembering these things." Sulu did not pay attention to this question. His eyes were cold and determined. It was as if he was looking at the lonely little grave in the west province of Donglin River. He asked in a low voice, "I only know that there were 2 batches of seeds of the Empire. Which batch did that person belong to?" "Not just 2 batches. In fact, it has always been in progress." Under the tree, Huai Chaoshi did not drink. She held a piece of beef jerky in her hand and said calmly, "You were in the last batch, but the list of your batch was destroyed. I was the one who destroyed that list." Feng Yu said a shocking fact. Looking at the 2 people under the winter tree, he said mockingly, "The original purpose of my teacher's seed plan was completely destroyed by that emperor of yours. It was originally to promote the integration of the 2 sides, but it was turned into the most clumsy spy plan. What was the point of continuing it?" Under the tree, Great Teacher looked at the red wine in his cup that kept reverberating. He thought of his father and sighed faintly. At that time, the federal forces were attacking the Empire's territory, which was before the explosion. Li Pifu and I found out about this at almost the same time. However, we thought that this was a plan that the Empire carried out according to my teacher's last wishes. We did not expect that my teacher had already started this plan many years ago. Therefore, we only know about the last batch. We do not know about the previous ones." Feng Yu used 3 fingers to hold the bottom of the wine glass and gently swirled it. He lowered his gaze and said, "At that time, I had already fallen out with the old man. However, that huge explosion wouldn't happen for another year, so I hated him. However, he didn't hate me that much. I negotiated with him and convinced him that those babies who didn't know anything were innocent. Under the condition that he agreed to remain silent, I promised to enter Tianjing planet for him and destroy that name list. There were very few people in that group, or rather, there were very few infants who were sent into the spatial passage by Huai Fuchai but were lucky enough to survive. He raised his head and looked into Su Li's eyes. You were the only one. At this moment, Master Fan, who was sitting under the tree, furrowed his brows and quickly moved his fingers. He suddenly raised his head, stared at Feng Yu and asked, "Was it that time when you snuck into Tianjing planet and abducted my sister?" Huai Chaoshi lowered her head slightly to express her attitude. She could not participate in this topic, as it involved the face and dignity of the empire's royal family. Feng Yu was silent for a moment and did not answer this question. He looked at Su Lu and continued, "The list was destroyed, and the tentacles that Bermuda extended into the Federation were also cut off. Therefore from then on, no one knew where you, the seed, was except for me. Father and I only knew that you were still alive and should be in the Federation, but we didn't know where you were. What's your name now? However, we really did not expect you to be in the East Forest, as the executor would usually choose to send the hero to the West Woods or the Upper Forest." Huai Chaoshi calmly looked at Su Li's back and said, "If you and Jian Shui'er had been engaged before entering the Empire, we would have known that you were not Nasri's illegitimate son. It would have been easier for us to understand everything." The great teacher drank a mouthful of red wine, shook his head, and sighed. "Back then, I insisted that you and Jian Shui'er were half-siblings. I even thought that Nasri did not care because he was perverted to a certain extent." Feng Yu laughed loudly. "No matter how perverted I am, I can't watch my children commit incest. Furthermore, how could I give birth to such a pedantic son?" Su Lu, who had been silent for a long time, suddenly raised his head. His thick, straight eyebrows furrowed uncontrollably. "Then, the old man should have guessed that I was from the Empire long ago. Before the old man died, he said that I was always by your side because I felt guilty towards you. In that case, he should have guessed this point, but I don't know when." Feng Yu's expression was indifferent. He extended his hand into the slightly cold air. True qi slowly gushed out, and a withered leaf above him fluttered like a butterfly. "This is not difficult to guess. Apart from the perverts of my Li family, those who can have this kind of ability are either surnamed Hua or Huai." Su Lu frowned, and the two hands hanging by his side were tightly clenched. He asked gloomily, "Then why didn't he expose me?" "Let's go back to that conversation. The old man talked about you before he died." Feng Yu smiled mockingly and said, "He said that if this was a gamble, then he had already entered the game and would definitely win. He couldn't accept it for the rest of his life. He couldn't understand one thing. Why would his younger brother, who was clearly a member of the Federation, stand on the opposite side of the so-called Federation and fight for the interests of the people of the Empire just because he had a teacher who was from the Empire?" He looked at Su Lu and said, "You are from the Empire, but you were raised by the people of the Federation. You lived in the Federation and received the education of the Federation. Li Pifu even raised you at all costs and truly loved you. He just wanted to know if you would be like me and still stand on the side of the Federation even after knowing your true identity." Huai Chaoshi said in a low voice, "Wishful thinking." Feng Yu looked at Su Lu with a faint smile. "Is that so? Although I think the old man's gamble is very childish, at least for now, I don't think he has lost. Back then, in the military prison of Qingqing, when the Federation's god of war Li Pifu met Su Lu for the first time, no one knew what kind of complicated mental process he went through. Even when the old man fell into eternal sleep in Feiqing, no one knew. But Su Lu himself remembered that meeting very clearly. It was not only because of the awe he felt when he first saw the most extraordinary snowy peak in the universe, but also because of many details of the meeting. At that time, the old man had asked him with an extremely serious expression, "Can you not betray the Federation?" "Of course. If something goes wrong in the future, I will personally kill you." Li Feng. Present. "If in the future Su Lu betrays the Federation and I die of old age, you will be responsible for killing him." "Yes, Marshal." Sulu, if you can remove the chip, you can go to the Empire and pretend to be a member of the imperial family. On a cold winter day, sweat suddenly seeped out of his clothes. Sulu stood on the wetland indifferently, silently thinking that the uncle's guess should be the closest to the truth. That old man should have guessed his true identity from the first time they met. But now, did he count as betraying the Federation? Nasri, why would your monster brother, who is even more cold-blooded than you, be so impulsive? Disregarding the safety of the foundation of the Federation and nurturing Sulu, the prince of the Empire, at all costs just to spite you? The great teacher shook his head and said, "This is not something Li Pifu would do. This is probably what Li Pifu is most willing to do. As long as I don't say it, no one in this world may guess that he is from the Empire. In fact, even if I say it, no one will believe me. Then, if we continue on the usual path, the one who will lead the federal forces to destroy the Empire in the future will definitely be the successor of the god of war, Sulu." Feng Yu said, "Let the Empire be destroyed in the hands of someone from the Empire. Don't you think this is the most interesting and powerful idea for an old man who has been following the rules all his life?" "It will be exposed one day," Huai Chaosher said with a frown. "Then it's even more interesting. The new god of war of the Federation is from the Empire. Then what will happen next?" "Please?" Feng Yu drank up the red wine in his cup and sneered, "Regarding this bet, he is not betting with me, but with the teacher he killed with his own hands. In my eyes, the old man has been living in the shadow of that incident for the rest of his life. He became the god of war because of it. Every time he is pushed up the altar by the Federation, the shadow in his heart becomes thicker. So, he really wants to know if what the teacher did back then was right." Feng Yu's expression was very sarcastic, and his laughter was very exaggerated and hurried. So fucking funny. Chapter 8:31. There's nothing funny about this matter to me. Sulu pinched the cigarette butt and looked around, as if he was looking for an ashtray. Then he realized how ridiculous he was. He curled his lips in self-mockery and threw the cigarette butt to the ground. He looked up at Feng Yu and said seriously, "If I have the chance to go to the Empire and see that emperor again, I will definitely ask him why he threw me here without my permission." Huai Chaosher under the winter tree frowned slightly. She was not used to the way Sulu addressed her. That should be His Majesty or Father, or at least Father. Feng Yu shrugged and finished the last puff of the cigarette. He spat the bitter saliva beside his feet and said, "I agree with that. That guy is indeed a bit perverted. But he is too far away. The old man is already dead. The three guys who changed my life are now right in front of me. So, just like how I always asked when I was young, I really want to ask you clearly." Sulu finished the red wine in the cup and put the cup on the broken cart. He looked at him and asked seriously, "Who are you, you son of a bitch? What right do you think you have to control my life? A traveler in the stars? No, the former great teacher might be, but you are not. In the past few decades, you have created so many storms in the universe. But revenge for your teacher? But why do you always stop when you're halfway through? Because you lack patience? Or is it because you are really cold in nature and don't care about anything? You, as George Carlin, opened the iron window above the heads of the people of the lower class and let them see the sun. Then, you started to smash the solid wall with all your might. The students and the anti-government army started to rebel happily. You even gave Chao Chiodao a blue light. The conflict intensified, and the war started. Where did you go in the end? You went to the Empire to support the underground resistance. You befriended Mr. Leader and put your other student, Chi Dabing, in there to help him become the next leader. In the end, you returned to the Federation. You just ignored it? You gave birth to a daughter, but in the end, you threw her to the old man you despised the most, while you wandered the universe and enjoyed yourself. You took in an apprentice, and that's me. Look at me now, don't you feel guilty? People from the Empire? People from the Federation? Thank you. I've lived for more than 20 years, but I still don't know who I am. I don't even know what I should be called. Do you think this is fun?" Sulu narrowed his eyes and looked at him. He spread out his hands and asked seriously, "Uncle Boss, Have you really never known how to write the word responsibility in your life? Feng Yu silently listened to him venting his emotions. Suddenly, he raised his eyebrows and said mockingly, "Responsibility? Why should I be responsible? How can I be responsible? I hate those 7 families that like to show off and are powerless, so I'm George Carlin, who debunks the hypocrisy and truth of society. I want to see those families beaten to the ground, but this doesn't mean that I'm going to carry the flag for those stupid people on the battlefield, because they want to pursue their own interests. Why should I expect a savior to complete everything?" Feng Yu's voice was full of mockery. Back then, Professor George Carlin supported the students in the Capital University to run a free newspaper. In the newspaper, he scolded the cowardly government, the incompetent army, and the mummified families that liked to sit in armchairs. He scolded everything from the president's wife to the eccentricity of the Liuan Palace. Later, the Sanlin Bank sent a huge sum of money. The students held a meeting with 2 topics. First, should they accept it? The conclusion was to accept it. Second, should they still scold them after accepting it? The conclusion was to still scold them. The reason was that they were shareholders after accepting the money. If they were shareholders, they naturally deserved to be scolded. I went to say that the students shouldn't have accepted the money. The students were unhappy and asked if the newspaper didn't need capital stock. I said that it wasn't capital stock. They asked what it was. As the story was told, Feng Yu's voice became sharper and sharper. He looked at Su Lu and shook his head. At that time, I wanted to say that it was a bribe. But when I found that the students in the newspaper mainly used the money to flirt with girls, I thought that it should be called whoring funding. So I stopped paying attention to the newspaper. The advanced young students had a huge amount of capital stock and naturally didn't need my signboard. They still scolded and were still happy. In the end, they were caught by the police in an unlicensed brothel and were charged with the crime of incest. Only then did this matter come to an end. Of course, I didn't think that these students should go to jail for 2 or 3 years just because they scolded a few people. So I went to the Liuan Palace and borrowed his small round hat to play with for 2 days. But this matter made me understand some things. These were some young students who had received higher education. If even they were so stupid and bastards, then why should I be responsible for the people who were even more stupid and bastards? What information asymmetry? What dark family? What unfair legal system? It's all fake. Humans are a very inexplicable creature. All the vile and despicable things are in everyone. Feng Yu spread out his hands and said with a smile, "As for the other things you want me to be responsible for, how can I be responsible for the teacher who died in the hands of his own brother? Kill him directly? Well, even if I killed my family for personal vengeance, I still have to be able to kill him. Does this count as being responsible?" I fell in love with a little girl when I was middle-aged. After she grew up, she took the risk of escaping from the imperial palace. I was just about to take her away when the house she lived in was blown to pieces by the Federation's missiles. Her body wasn't even found. How can I be responsible? I had just found my daughter when I was discovered by that damn charter computer. Tell me, how should I be responsible? Does that big explosion count? Does it count that I became the most wanted criminal of the Federation? Does it count that the old man finally broke up with me? Does it count that my rotten teeth? Does it count that the best friend of my life was in a cold war with the woman he loved most in the last few years before his death because he refused to sign the arrest warrant? His smile was very cold and his tone was very calm. But in this long paragraph, countless words were like countless sharp alloy knives that slashed at the quiet wetland, the thick fog, and the sky above the winter tree, leaving deep marks and scars everywhere. It was so sad that it was about to crack. Su Lu pursed his lips tightly and looked at him silently. Under the winter tree, the great teacher's mood was gloomy. There was a faint sadness in his eyes, probably because he thought of his dear sister and his other niece that he had never met before. Huai Chaosher, who was usually indifferent, had the most complicated expression at this moment. She was a little sad and a little lonely. She said in a low voice in self-mockery, "I don't care about the internal affairs of the Federation that you're talking about. When my mother fled the royal palace, I already have some vague memories. If she was still alive, I would like to ask her if she was responsible for abandoning her husband and daughter like this. When I first met your mother, she was just born. I watched her grow up, so I know her very well. Feng Yu's eyes were cold as he said slowly, although I didn't have the chance to ask her, I believe that the pain she felt when she left you was no less than yours. Then he continued indifferently, the people I knew back then all said that I was heartless, cold-blooded, and irresponsible, but who in this world has ever been responsible for me? I told Li Pifu that my epitaph in the future will be, I won't forgive anyone, and you don't have to forgive me either. A gentle breeze blew over, carrying a faint mist. Feng Yu's unkempt hair trembled in the wind. Only now did Su Lu notice that the wrinkles at the corners of his eyes were much deeper than before, and the silver at the roots of his hair was unusually striking. Perhaps it was because Li Pifu was already dead and the uncle had lost his last opponent in the universe. His eyes were wide and empty, so he appeared much older. Uncle, you're not someone who needs sympathy. After a moment of silence, Su Lu said, I never participated in your history, so I don't need to forgive you, and I also don't have anything that requires your forgiveness. I want to make this clear. Feng Yu smiled in relief and said, this is what I want to see. Teacher has been very good to me since I was young. He even gave me that ship. I have nothing to repay him with, so I chose to go to Donglin to watch you grow up. After all, I thought that you were the last seed in his plan, but in the beginning, I didn't plan to participate in your life. I didn't even plan to tell you about my true background. I remember that I once asked you why you chose me when there were so many repair shops in Donglin. Now, I vaguely understand that this is probably fate. Feng Yu raised his head and looked at the blurry sky that seemed to have countless faces like him. He said slowly, since you found me, then I can only bear this responsibility. You asked me if I've ever been responsible? At least you count as one. He lowered his head and looked at Su Lu. He said indifferently, my way of being responsible has always been different from others. I hoped that you would become a strong man who dared to hurt others and prevent yourself from being hurt, but I didn't expect that you would inexplicably become a good and detestable rock. So when you said that you won't forgive me, I'm very relieved. A man living in the stars should be an evil guest. Deep underground of the Bureau of Proclamation building, rows of data compiled in green machine language flowed on the giant 2D light screen. There was no Bureau of Proclamation staff in the spacious space. Only the data mixed with the faint sound of static electricity flowing at high speed, like a dark green waterfall. Other than some extremely strange and abnormal geniuses, no one could see or understand the true meaning of the machine language. Naturally, no one could see it clearly. Every 5 seconds, the image of an eye would appear in the green waterfall of data. It would appear for about 0.001 seconds. The eye had no human emotions. It seemed to be looking up into the distance. It was unknown where the indifferent gaze was looking through the countless meters of underground. Abnormalities 1 to 73 have been overlapped. The bait plan will enter the next phase. Draw up an attack plan and submit it to the relevant departments for approval. Warning: this is the first sequence of events. The Federal Central Computer coldly issued the warning. Then, the precise coordinates of the center of the wetland shrouded in thick fog were transmitted at the speed of light to the qualified departments. Chapter 8:32. Evil Guest? I've always paid for my meals. In the morning mist and wetland, Su Li's unrestrained rebuttal rang out. It was obvious that he did not intend to show any mercy to a certain person's conclusion that was full of life insights. You walk among the stars, shaking your big ass everywhere and pretending to be an evil guest. Then what am I? Don't I need to pay for the meal on your table after it's finished? Then, after so many years, you just sit down and sigh with a few words and call it a day? Even if you can threaten me, even if I'm old, shouldn't you at least treat me with a better attitude? Respecting the elderly is a form of courtesy. Feng Yu raised his eyebrows and roared at him. Yes, I didn't take care of you much in the East Forest, but without that cannon of mine, do you think that the infatuated princess, who thinks that she can tear apart the universe with brute force, could have escaped from that deadly prison? Huai Chaoshu glanced at him coldly with an expressionless face. Su Lu had long guessed that the main cannon of the battleship that came from beyond the atmosphere and blasted through the snowy night had something to do with the man in front of him, but he had no intention of thanking him at all. He said mockingly, "Old people are often as smug as children. It's really hard to respect them. I know that you are still immersed in the self-identity disorder and the inner struggles of those so-called artistic youths, so I don't blame you for losing your composure. I will take responsibility for you." Feng Yu paused for a moment and said calmly, "Go to the Empire, little guy. I believe that as long as you return to the Empire, the stories that will happen in the future should be able to mend your fragile heart and satisfy the ridiculous morals in your heart." Su Lu looked at him in silence, waiting for his explanation. Regarding this war, there is only one result. Between the Federation and the Empire, whoever can integrate the resources more effectively will obtain the final victory. In other words, the one who monopolizes power will definitely win. The president of the Federation, who likes to pretend to be a minor, saw through it a long time ago. That's why he wants to have power like an emperor. The people and the parliament are easy to deal with, but the few big families are a problem that he has to deal with. The problem with the Federation lies in the families that share a symbiotic relationship with it. If we ignore them, they will consume the flesh of the Federation, causing it to age, harden, and decay day by day. But if we try to dig out these tumors, the Federation will bleed to death. Feng Yu said mockingly, "If I can't do it, who else can?" On the contrary, your emperor in Left Sky Star area is cold-blooded, a bastard, and a hypocrite. Look at how he dealt with Keaton and the other princes. In the next 30 years, no one can shake his throne. Therefore, the Empire will definitely win. This was a war that spanned across the River of Stars and was very likely to set the entire universe ablaze. Yet, this man with a mouthful of rotten teeth in the morning mist casually pointed out the final outcome. Some of the 3 people present were willing to believe it, while others were unwilling to. However, they had to admit that even though this reasoning was simple and even unreasonable, since it came from his mouth, it was extremely powerful. Just like how he was so confident and even narcissistic when he mentioned the problems within the Federation, it was completely unquestionable. Even he could not overthrow the 7 great families, so how could the current government do it? You are not a guy who can watch your biological parents beat your adoptive parents until they are covered in blood without saying anything. Feng Yu looked at Su Lu and said, "Teacher wants peace. Right now, you should be in great need of this mental soothing agent. Therefore, you must return to the Empire and return to the side of that emperor of yours. You can even try being the emperor for a few days for fun." Under the winter tree, the great teacher stood up with the help of the tree trunk. Rubbing his back, he said, "The one who wants peace is my father. I will give it to him. I don't need a guy like you to meddle." Huai Chaoshu put down the wine cup in his hand and looked at Su Lu. "What we want is victory. Peace can only be the spoils of war after victory. But right now, I don't want anything, because these things have nothing to do with me." Su Lu shook his head and looked at Feng Yu. "In the end, my life has been played by you people. Please allow me to raise my middle finger to you old people from the depths of my heart. Furthermore, I don't want to continue being controlled by you people in the future." He raised his left hand. The metal bracelet on his wrist seemed exceptionally holy in the milky mist. "I will not return this bracelet to you. Just treat it as the compensation you gave me on behalf of everyone in the first half of my life." Then he shrugged and continued, "Furthermore, I believe that I deserve that sentence more than you do. In this aspect, I have the confidence to show off a little." Feng Yu looked at him and spread out his hands. "I have already returned that stupid electronic watch of yours to you. I snatched it from that idiotic student of yours." Su Lu did not back down. "I am very unhappy that you threw away the thing I gave you to someone else." Feng Yu said in disgust, "I mainly wanted to tell you that I am still alive. I don't want a little boy in this world to cry whenever he thinks of me." He scratched his head and said, "You should have finished asking your questions. It's my turn. I just want to know what's going on between you and that broken computer, and where did you get that weird permission from?" "I accepted the initiative to contact you. Su gave a simple answer. Some remnant information in the chip activated a backdoor program of the Federal Central Computer. Thus, I became the first target of protection. Remnant information? Feng Yu's brows furrowed as he thought of some very important questions. However, he did not explain anything. After a moment of silence, a faint self-deprecating smile appeared on his face as he said, "I escaped under its nose for several decades. Only now do I know that I actually had 71 chances to talk to that guy directly." "Do you regret it?" Su mocked. Feng Yu raised his eyebrows and laughed. "Talking to a stupid computer directly is too stupid." The strange and thick fog in the morning finally could not withstand the invasion of the sun and gradually showed signs of dissipating. Su looked at the uncle's weathered face and said, "Uncle, I don't care if you really dismantled that ship or not, but I know that you have a way to take them away from the Federation. Please take them away." Hearing this, Huai Chaosher, who was under the winter tree, frowned. She did not expect that Su Lu would still insist on not returning to the Empire with her under such circumstances. "What about you?" Feng Yu looked at his student with a smile that was not a smile and said, "You insist on staying." Master Fan suddenly thought of something and his expression changed slightly. He took 2 steps forward from under the tree and said in shock, "Kid, do you really want to learn from that guy in the 8-part opera and commit suicide in the end? Although you call this a hero plan and the Federation once made me a hero, I know very well that I am not cut out to be a hero. Of course, I will not commit suicide." Su looked at them and said with a smile, "We are not in the same boat, at least for now. Therefore, I will not board your boat. Besides, who knows when I will have my own boat? You want to stay and compare yourself with that stupid computer? You want to stay and test the level of evil in people's hearts?" Feng Yu replied with a smile, "Being a hipster is indeed a disease. You will die. I don't think the charter computer is very strong. I have endured it for the past 2 days by myself." Feng Yu said with a slight mocking tone, "You think it is not strong because it does not want you to think it is strong. Even if it is a stupid computer, it is still the most powerful stupid computer in the universe. Regarding these aspects, you are still too inexperienced. Therefore, you cannot understand its current thoughts." In about 3 minutes, a dense barrage of missiles and battleship main cannons will cover the area we are in now. Feng Yu took down a broken computer from the broken cart and pointed at the data stream on the screen of the workbench. He looked at the 3 of them and said with a smile, "I have never really defeated it in my life, but believe me, as long as I am alive, it will not be able to defeat me." On the 2-dimensional screen in the basement of the Bureau of Proclamation, the data stream compiled by the dark green mechanical language was still flowing. Just like how it had been for tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of years, there was no pause or change. The Federal Central Computer calculated all the missions with a cold mechanical mind and ordered them strictly according to the order and the degree of danger. For it, Feng Yu, who had countless identities, was undoubtedly a more important target than Su Lu. From the moment the Morning Dawn launched its main cannons during the riot in the military prison of Qingqing, the anomalies of missions 1 to 71 and 73 entered its field of vision. It used the fastest speed to draft a capture or elimination plan, which it named Bait. Just as Feng Yu had deduced, the real ability of the Federal Central Computer was definitely more powerful than what Su Lu had felt these days. However, the powerful and unshakable priority of the plan had created such a situation. If it was described in terms of anthropomorphic thinking, it was probably deliberately showing weakness to lure more important enemies into the encirclement. The overlapping of anomalies and the arrival of additional important targets directly triggered the relevant program. From the perspective of the plan, the Federal Central Computer's arrangements and calculations were very precise and perfect. There was nothing to nitpick about. The elimination plan was to be carried out in an uninhabited wildlife sanctuary. Although the dense fog affected the fixed location of the military satellite to a certain extent, as long as the amount of ammunition was increased, it could still guarantee that the targets would be completely eliminated in the first place. The 3 battleships on standby outside the atmosphere were ready to launch their main cannons. A certain land missile base in South Kazhou had launched a powerful missile. However, as time passed, the missile was still not launched. The plan drawn up by the Federal Central Computer had encountered some kind of setback. It had nothing to do with the data stream that had quietly snuck into the light and then disappeared like a thief. The Federal Central Computer had already done the core data protection. The green data stream on the two-dimensional light screen flowed slowly. After an unknown amount of time, the image of the eye that appeared once every 5 seconds quietly emerged. It calmly and silently watched the humans in the Bureau of Proclamation building and the officials who were fiercely debating in the official residence. It could not understand why its plan was so perfect and simple, but these humans were unable to carry it out. It had been at least 7 minutes since the alarm was sent and the request was submitted. However, the humans who had the authority still had not made a decision. Unable to directly carry out physical operations, the Federal Central Computer had to work under the orders of the humans. Therefore, it could only wait in silence. It could not even feel angry. It was so lonely and lonely. Chapter 8:33. In the underground meeting room of the president's residence, the heated argument was still going on. The National Security Advisor slammed the table angrily and yelled at the Bureau of Proclamation official in front of him. There are only 4 targets in total, and we have to send out 3 warships. And hundreds of Inferno missiles are going to be fired at them? Who the fuck came up with this plan? Is there something wrong with the charter computer? Sir, those aren't normal targets. The current situation is that even if the Bureau of Proclamation activates the program to open the electronic fence, by the time the special forces arrive, those 4 people will have already escaped. The most important thing is that none of us are confident that we can capture these people with our ground forces. The Deputy Minister of Defense retorted with a gloomy face. Hundreds of Inferno missiles and warships do seem exaggerated, but we really need such powerful firepower. If the charter computer didn't make a mistake, other than Su Le, the Empire's princess, and the Empire's great teacher, the other person is the mechanic Yu Feng. 6 years ago, when the 4 military regions carried out the last assassination mission, they sent out mecha teams and warships, but they still let him escape. Sir, I hope you won't forget this point. Sitting at the end of the long table, General Li Jiedu had been silent the whole time. He looked at the operation plan in front of him thoughtfully. His digital pen lightly moved, and no one knew what he was thinking. The old man who appeared in the middle of the wetland was his uncle, the person he was most wary of after that night of coffin support. He had hoped countless times that this person wouldn't appear, but in the end, that person still came. As a member of the Federation, of course I know the importance of those 4 targets, but I have to remind you of one thing. The National Security Advisor pointed at the electronic map on the screen and roared. The protected area is close to the back of Macho Mountain. The target location is less than 7 kilometers away from the manor. That is the Tai family area recognized by the government. What do the missiles and warships mean? Could it be that they want to declare war on Lady Tai? Or is the government ready to declare war on all 7 families? He took out a handkerchief and wiped the sweat on his forehead. Coldly looking around, he said in a hoarse voice, "You are only thinking about the war between the Federation and the Imperium, but I am more worried about whether the Federation will officially enter a civil war because of this attack." There was silence in the conference room. The generals and officials knew very well that what the security advisor was worried about was very frightening. However, the Federation would not allow such a situation to happen if they did not launch an attack while the Empire's princess was right in front of them. Li Jiedu, who had been silent all this while, suddenly spoke, "Launch a warship attack." The Deputy Minister of Defense beside him frowned and said, "The main cannon of the warship is an instant attack. Logically speaking, there should be no problem. However, Mechanic Yu Feng can't use conventional logic. Without missiles to increase the coverage, the attack is very likely to fail." At this moment, the heavy alloy door of the conference room slid open smoothly, and President Pabre, who had forcibly interrupted an important trip, hurried in. He waved his hand to stop everyone from standing up and saluting, and said in a deep and powerful voice, "Execute the plan according to the central computer." The generals and officials in the conference room were slightly stunned. Their expressions were all different, and they immediately began to implement the battle plan. The president placed his hands on the table and silently looked at the light screen above his head. His expression was abnormally solemn. The madam of the back mountain had just made a decision that shook him. She had opened up the crystal mining consortium. In the face of such a concession, the government had to make a corresponding response. The Parliament Hill needed a very long time to review the matter. However, could the government's response be the attack of the warship's main cannon and countless missiles? In terms of political stability, the president should have chosen a more reliable method, but he did not. He directly and forcefully issued the order to attack, because in the center of that wetland were two important figures of the empire, the most wanted criminal of the Federation, and more importantly, Su Lu was there. President Pabre looked at Li Jiedu and said expressionlessly, "I will immediately call Lady Tai to avoid causing her to make a wrong judgment." That madam will not make a wrong judgment. The troublesome thing is that she is very willing to make a wrong judgment and then seek the relevant benefits, Li Jiedu calmly replied. Some people can use the overall benefits of the Federation to bargain, but we cannot. The president looked at the satellite image on the light screen and looked at the ground that was faintly discernible in the fog. He said indifferently, "We must be responsible for the Federation." In the center of the wetland, the winter tree gradually became more and more blurred behind the several figures. Mechanical calculation is never a real thought process. The seemingly omnipotent central computer of the Federation is actually not that scary. No matter how powerful the tool is, it is just a broken tool in the hands of the stupid and indecisive human. Uncle Feng Yu reached out and took the box of brand 37 cigarettes from Su Lu, who was pushing the cart. He took out a cigarette and lit it. He walked slowly and talked slowly, completely ignoring the countdown and the possibility of the imminent terrorist attack. His disdainful and indifferent expression was incomparably powerful and vigorous. There is a theory that the key point of the official origin of human beings before the catastrophe was learning how to use tools. In my opinion, it is very regretful or shameful that human beings have not evolved a bit since then, especially the way they use tools is still so clumsy. Feng Yu glanced at the broken light screen of the broken computer on the broken cart and shrugged. Even if the central computer has protected the core data, it is meaningless. It has to wait for someone to give the order. But people have to think, if they throw a bomb here, what will the old woman behind the mountain in front think? I didn't choose this place blindly. On the other side of the broken cart, Huai Chaoshi suddenly frowned and asked, "You chose this place?" "Of course." Feng Yu proudly lifted the black hair in front of his forehead, revealing his true colors below. "The data in your intelligence department were all left by me. Otherwise, which agent of the Imperium do you think could have chosen such a good place for you?" Su Li's expression changed slightly, and he lowered his head and continued to push the cart in silence. Although he had roared angrily about the miserable life of child labor earlier, some things had been deeply rooted in his bones, such as working as a coolie for the uncle, and such as standing on the Federation's side habitually and thinking as a person of the Federation, especially a soldier of the Federation. "Can your expression not be so stiff?" Feng Yu looked at him mockingly. "You are not a person of the Federation, I am. Besides, other than your crazy and perverted sister, who do you think can use this data?" At this moment, a low humming sound came from the sky far away, as if several grand pianos were playing at the same time in an empty room. Su Lu narrowed his eyes, but he did not turn around. He knew that countless missiles were tearing apart the fog and flying toward the winter tree behind him. Feng Yu and Huai Chaoshi, who were walking on the two sides of the broken cart, were indifferent and did not turn around. But Great Teacher, who was walking at the front, looked back, only to discover that the morning fog where everybody had been had strangely disappeared. The wetland was clear and bright, and the winter tree had disappeared at some point. Where it had been standing stubbornly before, a few soundless black holes could be vaguely seen. 300 Ardent Fire 2 missiles were launched, and countless explosions rang out one after another, as if the deepest drum of an orchestra was beating the ground. The wetland began to tremble. The frost-white grass, the gradually solidifying ice, and the remaining branches were dismembered by the cheers of the high-energy explosives. The debris that they turned into at the cost of their lives drifted in the air. Before they could fall, they began to burn fiercely again, turning into a real fire that covered several kilometers. At the edge of the raging fire, there were 4 people who seemed to be leaving slowly but were actually leaving quickly. They were not riding horses, nor carrying sticks. They were just pushing a small cart. They were not afraid or flustered. Even the burning wilderness behind them could not make them stay silent for a while. The uncle leaned against the broken cart lazily with a cigarette between his lips, blowing a cheerful whistle that was not sad at all, as if he were playing the accompaniment for the terrifying explosion behind him. Walking to a nameless puddle, Sulu looked at the uncle next to the cart and could not help but remark, "Uncle, I have to admit that your narcissism is very reasonable. You are indeed vigorous." "This is vigorous? When I was vigorous, I was much more vigorous than this. Pure seafood." Feng Yu looked at him and said mockingly, "To deal with that broken computer, it is not enough to understand it. The more important thing is to understand those who use it. What are those government officials and generals thinking in their heads? What are they hesitating about? And what can we use in between?" Tools were used by humans. To fight against a powerful tool was, in fact, to fight against the people who used it. This seemed to be a very simple principle, but Sulu knew very well how difficult it was to use this method to find the gaps between those lights, because the complexity of the human thought pattern was even more complex than that of the charter computer. "This is not difficult." Feng Yu looked at him and said indifferently, "When you turn this judgment into some kind of vague instinct like me, there won't be any problems. But since you insist on not getting on my boat, when you are chased by that broken computer in the future, don't cry and ask me to be your uncle." Sulu listened silently and seriously. Then he smiled, knowing that the uncle had taught him the most important lesson today. Then his smile gradually faded, knowing that it was time to say goodbye after they had just reunited. What made him a little confused and at a loss was that this separation was the result of his own persistence, and he could not even clearly explain why he was so insistent. Feng Yu removed the cigarette from between his lips and raised his head to look at the steep cliff not far away. His usually arrogant and indifferent face that was full of vicissitudes of life suddenly showed a rare trace of emotion. The old man said that he had already entered this gamble and would definitely win. "It probably means that he has seen through you. You little guy are a stinking rock, and you won't give up until you are smashed into pieces." Feng Yu said thoughtfully, "You are all the same kind of people, always liking to gamble with your lives. But in my opinion, life should not be wasted like this. If you care too much about something, you will be dragged into the abyss by those things, and it will be difficult to rise again." He raised his head and looked at the clear blue sky that was gradually revealing its true appearance. He said mockingly, "Just like this crappy computer of yours. More than 10 billion dogs are chained to the Federation, but in the end, you have become a dog for more than 10 billion people." Chapter 8:34. Anything that you care about can be a dog chain? Including hometown, lover, hot-bloodedness, honor, comrades. Sulu looked at the white cliff reflected in the shallow pool in front of him. After a moment of silence, he raised his head and looked at Feng Yu with a smile. "I also don't want to be tied by a dog chain, even if it's related by blood or something like that. So, I have to break free with force and then walk my own path." Feng Yu looked at him calmly. "Even if it means death?" "Even if it means death." Sulu turned around and looked at White Sausher's messy and slightly dirty purple hair. He looked at her ordinary face and looked at her small eyes. "Sorry, I'm very grateful for you coming, but I really can't leave with you." After saying this, he hesitated for a moment and then opened his arms somewhat stiffly. White Sausher's expression froze slightly. She opened her arms like him, right arm slightly up, left arm slightly down, and slowly and hesitantly took a step forward. The two of them crossed their arms somewhat awkwardly. Their upper bodies leaned forward and gently hugged like two pieces of wood. Then they separated. "Can you promise me one thing?" Su looked into her eyes and said softly. Huai Chaoshu looked at him quietly. Su hesitated again and said with some difficulty, the thing you took from Zhou is too big of a threat to the Federation. After we return to the Empire, can I trouble you to destroy it? Huai Chaoshu's eyes gradually narrowed. There was some coldness and faint disappointment in her eyes. Su knew that there was no way for him to not be angry when he said something like this at this moment. He lowered his head and said, if that thing falls into your hands and is cracked, too many people in the federal forces on the front lines will die. Although probably no one thinks so right now, some of them are my subordinates and comrades after all. Then, have you ever thought about how many fewer Imperial soldiers would die if that little blue device was cracked? And they are your real compatriots? Huai Chaoshu narrowed his eyes and slowly clenched his fists. After a while, he slowly released them and said with a trace of tiredness that was difficult to suppress, I promise you. Thank you, Su said. I know you're disappointed. I'm sorry. Huai Chaoshu looked at him coldly and said, I know what kind of person you are, so my real disappointment is that since you don't want to go home with me, your last words before leaving are actually this. That wasn't the last sentence. Su looked at her and paused for a very long time. Then he said, I will go to the Empire to see your sister. Hearing these two words, Huai Chaoshu's narrowed eyes slowly relaxed. The lines and expression on her face that seemed to be carved from steel suddenly melted into the branches of spring. She reached out and patted Su Li's shoulder. Without saying anything, she turned around and left. Crossing the river of stars to come to the Federation, disregarding the risk of life and death, even throwing the Empire and all of her responsibilities to the back of her mind, this most powerful princess just wanted to bring her younger brother home. Even though her wish was not fulfilled, she was already satisfied to hear the last two words. The wilderness was full of the pungent smell of residual fire and ammunition. The frosty grass by the wetland was completely withered and charred. The three people walked into the smoke. They could faintly hear some very unnutritious dialogue. They could vaguely imagine what kind of story would happen in the long journey that followed. I didn't expect that I would have to be a nanny for once when I'm old. This was the uncle's arrogant and infuriating sigh. Nasri, I definitely don't mind beating you until you can't take care of yourself. This was Huai Chaoshu's calm and confident threat. Yes, I'm very willing to be his nanny in this situation. This was the direct expression of a master. Seeing those figures disappear into the wildfire and wild grass, Su slowly retracted his gaze. He tidied up his equipment and silently left to the other side, his face expressionless. He could not go back to the Empire with Huai Chaoshu. He had killed too many people from the Empire. Macklin was his uncle, and that butcher Keaton should also be some kind of relative. In this kind of situation, he did not know how to face that strange country. This was not the key to the matter. He believed that Her Majesty had enough methods and iron blood to suppress all voices of dissent. The real key was that he had been to the Empire before. He did not like the Empire. Compared to the Dark Federation, the human world of the Left Heavenstar region was even more naked and dark. He could not imagine that he would live a peaceful life in that kind of hierarchical society and enjoy the blood and sustenance of hundreds of millions of lowly people. He could not imagine that he would one day lead the Imperial Royal Army to fight against the Federation. He could not imagine that one day he might run into the 17th Division, He Lei, Xiong Linquan, Hua Xiaoxi, Gu Shifeng, and the others on the battlefield, but he had to raise the gun in his hand. Wander together with the uncle? A slightly cold pain appeared in the depths of Su Li's eyes. The uncle had just said that the mine disaster that killed his parents and Xian Yi was caused by the previous generation of seeds of the Empire, but other than him, even the Imperial royal family did not know where he was, so how could that seed of the Empire know? He walked alone in the wetlands and entered the short shrubs at the foot of the mountain. He did not pay attention to the fighter jets whistling through the sky. His heart was heavy and frustrated. He could not go to the Empire, and he could not stay in the Federation. The universe was so big, so where should he go? At the edge of the new moonlight and shadow, a quiet and broken tri-winged spaceship floated in the dark space. Inside this spaceship that looked down on human society like a ghost, an angry and resentful voice echoed. This electronic voice was perfectly simulated to have a hoarse and slightly hoarse texture. It definitely did not have a cold feeling, but was rather charming. Core program protection? You clearly did not know of my existence, so why did you make the core program protection? Is it because of that stinky uncle with a mouth full of rotten teeth that Sulu spoke of? Or did you intuitively discover my intentions? Beep beep. You actually managed to deceive this young master. This old lady will fight it out with you. Green streams of data flashed quickly on the narrow workbench's hologram. Student Philip had discovered the abnormality of the Federal Central Computer. He was so ashamed that he became angry and cursed nonstop, as if someone was jumping around with their hands on their hips. Since he had discovered the problem, Philip immediately began to work. Although he could not see the light of breaking through the core protection of his own body in a short time, through the ubiquitous electronic monitoring network, he immediately discovered the source of the problem. The hologram on the hologram quickly zoomed in, showing a wetland that still had a faint trace of smoke remaining. My little master, where are you hiding? Philip used a very short time to scan the wetland and confirmed that Sulu was not dead and had left. He could not help but grumble in disappointment. During this period of time, the tri-winged battleship floating in the sky above New Moon was mainly carrying out two tasks. The first was to compete with the Bureau of Proclamation's main body for the leadership of the Federation of Light. Although the central computer did not discover the existence of this fellow and did not do anything, it still firmly held the leadership. However, the embarrassed and angry Philip insisted that this was a very difficult battle, and that he had only lost because he did not have enough resources. The second task was to search for Su Li's whereabouts. However, the Federal Central Computer could not find Su Li, and naturally, the tri-winged battleship could not find him either. Philip quietly hacked into the monitoring network and began to continuously monitor 50 important locations. These monitoring points were all locations in his memory that had a special meaning to Su Li. Linhai State's Lihua University, including the library, the H1 area, the Iron Gate, and the female dormitory. Linhai State's gymnasium, especially the underground parking lot. Shell Motor Company's headquarters, especially the Research Institute, as well as the Whitewater Security Company, the Ministry of Defense building, the training base, and the Wangdu Youth Residence. The voice in the tri-winged battleship suddenly quieted down, and a tea house on the street next to the Wangdu Youth Residence appeared on the screen. Outside the tea house was a little girl wearing a pink sweater and carrying a heavy school bag. She looks very familiar. The streets of the capital in winter seemed particularly bleak. The annoying wind passed through the apartment buildings, cutting the faces of pedestrians like knives, and the bodies of trees before smashing themselves into ice shards under the walls or windows. Zhong Huayan stood outside the floor-to-ceiling glass window of a tea house. She exhaled a mouthful of white fog, brushed off the ice on her mask, and put it back on. Her two eyes, which were exposed outside the large mask, looked around attentively at the youth residence opposite her, not caring about the frost hanging on her slender eyelashes. The sweater was very thick, and the earmuffs were very warm. The little girl was not very afraid of the cold, but the backpack on her back was too heavy. Her feet were a little stiff, and she couldn't help but stamp her feet. She thought silently in her heart, I've already searched the Shishan Courtyard and Charter Square. Could it be that I really have to go to Linhai State? She wasn't afraid of the long journey, but she was worried that in the process of searching, she would miss that guy again. Inside the floor-to-ceiling glass window, the owner of the tea house, who was also a waiter, kept looking at the little girl outside the window curiously. Doing business on the street, the owner didn't know how many strange situations he had seen over the years, but in such a cold winter, a little girl who was fully equipped to resist the cold actually stood on the street for half a day. It was really rare. What kind of perseverance did this require? He couldn't help but think of the beautiful woman who cut her cheek in the tea house that year. His heart slightly moved, he knocked on the glass and smiled to indicate that the little girl could come in to warm herself. Zhong Huayan heard the knocking behind her and curiously looked back. After understanding the other party's meaning, she shook her head to indicate that she didn't need to. Although the big mask covered 2/3 of her face, her eyes narrowed like the moon, clearly showing the sweet smile of gratitude. A man wearing a woolen coat walked out of the restaurant next door. The man was obviously drunk, and the words he muttered indicated that he should be a government official. Just as his subordinate went to get the car, the man noticed Zhong Huiyan standing on the street side of the tea house. He saw her beautiful and clean eyes and didn't know why his heart moved. He staggered over and put his arm around the little girl's shoulder. He laughed and said, "Little girl, where are your parents?" The door of the tea house was pushed open, and the owner ran out. He pointed at him and shouted, "What are you doing?" Although through the mask, the stench of alcohol could still be smelled. Zhong Huiyan frowned in disgust. She felt that the hands that were holding her shoulders were getting tighter and tighter. She finally couldn't help but put her right hand into her pocket. Chapter 8:35. The drunk official squinted at the owner of the tea house. His arms were still around Zhong Huiyan. He belched and shouted angrily, "What's with your attitude? Do you know who I am?" Because of this arrogant attitude, the owner of the tea house was slightly shocked. His courage to rush out suddenly decreased by more than half. But looking at the little girl who was forcibly held in the arms of the official, he still whispered a few words of advice. He knew that on this street, no matter how drunk the official was, he would not dare to do anything outrageous. At most, he would take advantage of her. Although it was perverted, the little girl should not be in any danger. Some people came out of the street next to them and looked at this scene curiously. The official's face was a little embarrassed, as if he had been greatly insulted. He kept shouting and waving his arms excitedly, almost hitting Zhong Huiyan's cheek. In the quarrel, things like asking for the direction of the toilet and the government's special investigator being on the same level as them were not qualified to enter Zhong Huiyan's ears. She patted the drunk official's chest and abdomen and suddenly smiled. Her eyes outside the mask narrowed into a new moon. She said sweetly, "Uncle, you're hurting me." The little girl's voice was very clear and soft. The drunk official laughed foolishly and let go of his hand. He tried to reach out and pat her little face frivolously and said vaguely, "Good girl, really?" A scream came out of the official's mouth, which instantly covered the sizzling sound of the electric arc. He, who was attacked by the electric current, painfully covered his lower abdomen. His drunkenness suddenly disappeared, and he stared at the innocent little girl in front of him in disbelief. He twitched and fell to the cold concrete ground. There was suddenly a burst of exclamations in the crowd. The smile on Zhong Huiyan's face gradually disappeared. She looked at the official who was rolling at her feet expressionlessly. Without hesitation, she pressed the button of the taser in her hand again. The blue electric arc tore through the dry air and hit the man's lower abdomen accurately again. The cloth between his legs was burned black. This time, the crowd did not exclaim. Instead, they all gasped in unison. Especially those middle-aged men, they subconsciously tilted their buttocks backwards, as if the terrifying electric arc could hit their vital parts at any time. Their posture was extremely comical. The things made by Su Lu are really useful. Zhong Huiyan shrugged and put the stun baton back into her pocket. Then, she looked at the surrounding crowd and said coldly, "Any uncle who has evil thoughts about a little girl should end up like this." Then she turned her head and smiled sweetly at the owner of the tea house, saying, "You're a good uncle. Do you want to treat me to some hot tea?" The ambulance came and left. Perhaps it was too embarrassing, but the official did not call the police. The crowd gradually dispersed. Zhong Huiyan's feet were a little stiff from the cold. She was quite tired from the days of searching and waiting, so she went straight into the tea house behind her and asked for a cup of hot tea and a plate of snacks. "If you have any trouble in the future, just call the number on the card and tell her that the card is from me." Zhong Huiyan took a sip of the slightly hot flower tea and sighed contentedly. She stuck out the tip of her tongue and handed the card to the confused owner. She smiled and said, "Don't worry. From today onwards, except for a few people, no one in the Federation will dare to provoke you." The owner of the tea house looked at the name Nan Xiangmei on the card and the signature of a second-level teacher training foundation. He couldn't help but smile bitterly. He thought to himself, what can a female teacher do? What a childish little girl. She probably thinks that teachers are the most terrible existence in the world. Zhong Huiyan did not pay attention to the owner's complex psychological activities. Her eyes were attracted by the news on the screen. The news channel of the Federation was reporting on a meteorite impact that happened in the suburbs of the capital today. According to the news report, this meteorite impact was quite rare. The earthquake waves caused by it could even be seen as far away as Nank. Fortunately, it happened in the center of the wildlife reserve, otherwise it would have caused a lot of casualties. As for the meteorite impact S1, the Federal Academy of Science had already calculated the relevant trajectory 3 years ago. However, in order to not cause unnecessary psychological panic, it had not been made public. At this time, the news on the screen suddenly changed to another picture. The picture was of a group of buildings in the capital. It should have been filmed by the TV station's helicopter. In the center of the picture, a blurred figure was crossing the buildings at an incredible speed. Neither the high walls nor the surrounding police cars could slow down his speed. Zhong Huiyan's pupils shrank. She suddenly stood up. The teacup and snack plate in front of her fell to the ground. She did not react at all. She just stared at the TV screen and the figure running at high speed. The TV screen remained silent for a long time. In the silent picture, the figure sometimes ran like lightning through the narrow alleys. Sometimes it was like a cheetah crossing the long streets. Sometimes it was like an antelope jumping on the eaves of the low houses. Sometimes it was like an ape climbing on the steep and slippery surface of the buildings. With an ability that humans could not imagine, it crossed all obstacles. He sometimes appeared and sometimes disappeared. However, he was unable to get rid of the increasing number of hunting teams and the countless flying objects in the sky. Then, the powerful voiceover of the famous female announcer finally appeared on the news screen. The Empire's spy, Su Lu, has once again appeared unscrupulously. This is the most naked challenge to the dignity of the Federation. Citizens, at this moment, the Federation needs you. Today, we are all warriors. Fight your mother. Zhong Huiyan clenched her fist and muttered softly in a daze. Feng Yu was right. The ability of the Federal Central Computer was more terrifying than Su Lu had imagined. After climbing over the electronic wall and returning to the city, in just a few hours, he had encountered several of the most dangerous encounters in his life. Once the omnipresent glory of the charter was fully activated, it was actually so terrifying. In the city, inside and outside the buildings, there were no loopholes. The whistling bullets and the whistling sound of the helicopter above his head were like countless invisible and hard ropes that were slowly and unstoppably tightening. In the next moment, they were going to choke his throat and suffocate him to death. Facing the whistling cold wind, Su Lu madly ran up and down the buildings. His chest rapidly and exaggeratedly moved up and down. He inhaled oxygen at the highest efficiency and converted it into much-needed energy. He keenly heard the sirens from all directions. He had no time to pay attention to the Federation News Channel's helicopter above his head. After falling into a desperate situation again, he should have felt regret. For example, he chose to stay instead of leaving with the uncle. However, no one knew that at this moment his mood was actually so calm. Many people wanted him to die, and some people wanted him to leave. However, after knowing the story of his past, he was frustrated and lonely. He needed warmth. He wanted to find his own place, so he didn't want to leave the Federation. He didn't want to leave the city that he was once so familiar with but now so unfamiliar with. From a psychological analysis, this was probably a hidden self-destructive tendency at work. Su Lu faintly felt this destructive emotion, but he didn't care. Because no matter how big the world was, it was not as important as his mood. He just didn't want to fucking leave, die, or commit suicide. What's wrong with him? When one was on the verge of despair, it was the easiest to stimulate one's potential. Su Li's brain worked faster than ever as he ran. His fingers dug into the hard concrete wall, propelling his body to draw an arc in the air. While he swept past the police cars on the street, he had already determined where he was going to run to next. According to the last lesson taught by the uncle, Su Lu was no longer trying to figure out how to avoid the scanning of the charter computer. Instead, he was constantly calculating the ratio of firepower of the federal forces. Because of the dense population in the city, the Federation would use a large number of sniper rifles. Therefore, he had never left the bustling business district. Using the tall buildings tightly huddled together to block the distant shots, he strictly followed the line of blind spots and madly ran. Hard pottery bulletproof vest, soft metal anti-cutting strips, guns were still guns. In close combat on the streets and alleys, there was simply no one who could stop him. However, after continuously being discovered and hunted down so many times in an extremely short period of time, he had consumed too much of his strength in an extremely short period of time. He couldn't stay in one place for more than 5 seconds, and exhaustion began to invade his body. Now was the most dangerous moment. The Federation government was almost crazy and began to broadcast the process of him being hunted down. Even at the great political risk, they wanted to mobilize the power of the people. This method was very powerful. Su Lu from the Empire suddenly became a rat crossing the street, caught in the vast ocean of the people's war. Every electronic valve in the streets and alleys was guarded by brave people holding wooden sticks. As for every Federation citizen he met who had once loved him, as long as they saw him now, their faces would become twisted and they would charge at him fearlessly. What was even more frightening was that Madman Li should be in the combat force hunting him this time. Although Su Lu didn't see it, he could clearly feel the pressure. Closer, closer and closer. The powerful and violent footsteps were right behind him. Madman Li had already seen Su Li's back in front of him. With a heavy expression, he sped up his steps, the soles of his feet pounding the ground like iron hammers. As long as he caught up and entangled that troublesome person, the Federation forces following closely behind would definitely be able to easily tear him to pieces. Snowflakes floated down from the sky without warning. Mixed in the snowflakes was the dull and determined sound of a gunshot. Li Feng's expression suddenly changed. His feet reacted extremely quickly and heavily stomped down, forcibly creating a small hole in the ground. His body violently trembled as he backed up, avoiding the high-speed gunshot from afar. Immediately after, 6 sniper rifle bullets were clearly and extremely intimidatingly fired in succession. Pooh, 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 pooh. On the ground and walls, 6 flowers of cement and dust instantly bloomed. The extremely precise bullets actually forced him out of the back alley of the building. The gunshots stopped. Li Feng turned his head and looked ahead. There was no trace of Su Lu in front of him. His expression was extremely ugly. 2 kilometers away, on one of the floors of the only building that could lock onto the back alley, Magnolia silently lowered her head and disassembled the sniper rifle. Her mouth continuously chewed on the orchid-flavored chewing gum. In the past year, she had gotten used to holding the kitchen knife in her hand, so her movements of disassembling the gun were still as smooth as before. The fluttering hair on her forehead had long been cut short, but her aura was still as seductive and enchanting. You're tuning in to the Dreamy Chapters YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.